I'm Paul Kennedy. Welcome to Ideas. He was a brilliant, eccentric, complicated man. A member of Britain's colonial police force, a critic and a journalist, a dishwasher, a fighter in the Spanish Civil War, a teacher and a shopkeeper, and one of the most influential writers of our time. His name was Eric Blair, better known as George Orwell.
Who here has an iPhone? Who here has a BlackBerry? Who here uses Gmail?
WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange.
Well, you're all screwed.
Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. George Orwell.
British journalist Luke Harding said when he typed anything critical of the American National Security Agency, something strange happened.
The stories that we published were all about the mass collection of data, the fact that your communications, our communications, are being hoovered up.
The paragraph I had just written, he said, began to self-delete, gobbling text. I watched my words vanish.
It's a beautiful thing, the destruction of words. George Orwell.
George Orwell warned us of the danger of worldwide mass surveillance.
Fugitive whistleblower Edward Snowden.
A child born today will grow up with no conception of privacy at all. They'll never know what it means to have a private moment to themselves, an unrecorded, unanalyzed thought.
He never found anything that was comforting and that brought him any peace and happiness, and he was always on edge, always worrying and always typing.
This sort of mixture of being very close to reality and yet always the presence of some kind of idea, a rather noble sort of idea running behind it. I mean, I adored Orwell, really. That's what it comes to.
CBC is the only media organization in the world with a comprehensive archive of recordings featuring people who knew Orwell, from his earliest days to his final moments. 75 people, 50 hours of recordings. Some of this oral history was included in George Orwell, A Radio Biography, which CBC Radio aired on January 1st, 1984, the first day of Orwell's famous year. But much of it is being aired now for the first time.
He had dark hair, quite untouched with grey, which bristled upwards untidily, very thin, a hatchet face with two great lines carved into it.
His eyes were marvellous, clear and glittery, and they had humour in them.
He looked sad at times, but he still managed to crack the odd joke.
He always talked in a sort of rather monotonous kind of growl. I always used to think that it was like going through a sort of London fog having a conversation with George Orwell.
He had a loving heart, although he didn't find it easy to show it.
He was the quintessence of an English gentleman with his corners rubbed off.
Asleep or awake, working or eating, indoors or out of doors, in the bath or in bed, no escape. Big Brother is watching you.
Big Brother is watching you might be Orwell's most famous line from his most famous book, 1984. But there are so many more. Lines about truth.
In time of deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act.
Lines about freedom.
If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they don't want to hear.
And of course, lines which gave the world new terms, like newspeak and doublethink.
Doublethink means the power of holding two contradictory beliefs in one's mind simultaneously and accepting both of them.
1984, Animal Farm, Down and Out in Paris and London, The Road to Wigan Pier, and Homage to Catalonia, Orwell's account of the Spanish Civil War. It's an impressive list of books. And it gets even more impressive when you add his more important essays, like Politics and the English Language.
Political speech and writing are largely the defense of the indefensible.
And the prevention of literature.
To write in plain, vigorous language, you have to think fearlessly. And if you think fearlessly, you can't be politically orthodox.
Orwell, more than anyone else in his time, elevated political writing into an art form. One of the last things he ever wrote was a short entry in his notebook.
At 50, everyone has the face they deserve.
But Orwell didn't make it to 50. He died from tuberculosis in a hospital bed when he was 46 years old.
And his grave here has just an old English rose on it, which he asked for. And it says, "Here lies Eric Arthur Blair," which was, of course, his proper name, born June the 25th, 1903, died January the 21st, 1950.
Orwell was a very private man, skilled at keeping the people in his life in different compartments. Each had only one part of the bigger picture. No one had it all. To get that, you have to piece together the memories and insights of many people. And in 1983, as Orwell's fateful year approached, it was still possible to do that. In that summer, CBC producer Steve Wadham spent 2 months traveling through England, Scotland, and Spain, recording interviews with the people you'll hear in this series. So, welcome to the Orwell Tapes, produced and presented by Steve Wadhams. Episode 1 is called To Burma and Back.
I was born into what you might describe as the lower upper middle class.
George Orwell was very precise about his place in the pecking order of the English class system, and it's possible to see the story of his life as one long struggle to escape from it, a struggle that came with more defeats than victories. And in his novels, too, the heroes invariably rebel against the system and invariably fail. I can sympathize. Like anyone born and raised in England, I know how deeply class is ingrained in every thread of English life, how corrosive and confining it can be, and how your accent will always give you away. I doubt if the scorn and ridicule meted out to people who try to be, as they say, something they're not, is any less now than it was when I was growing up. As far as I know, the phrase social climber is never said as a compliment. And that's where Orwell was different. He was a social climber, but he wanted to climb down the ladder, not up, to understand and write about Britain's down and outs and underdogs by getting up close and personal, living on the streets as a tramp, spending months in cheap boarding houses or renting a room in a working-class home. One of his friends said he was the only person he knew who went native in his own country. It shocked his friends, and it certainly didn't please his class-conscious parents. So let's begin at the beginning. Orwell wasn't actually born in England. He was born in India, which at the time was a British colony. His father, Richard Blair, worked in the lower levels of the colonial civil service. He was a sub-deputy opium agent. And in those days it was common for families like this to spend many years apart.
He was in India, and she came back to start to, get a house and get organised, ready for when he came back from India.
And it would be several years before Mr. Blair retired from the colonial service and joined his wife and family. Meanwhile, Mrs. Blair, who was 18 years younger than her husband and by all accounts a much more lively and unconventional person, lived a very pleasant life.
Well, she was quite formidable. I was slightly frightened of her.
I met Orwell's niece, Jane Morgan. She showed me a family treasure, Mrs. Blair's diary for 1905.
Saturday, the 8th of July, I went to Wimbledon to see the tennis finals. I saw Miss Sutton win the ladies and Mr. Doherty the gentlemen's singles. Glorious day. Quite a nice time, really.
except that the health of her 2-year-old son, Eric, was always a worry.
Yes, you see, Eric, here there are accounts here. This is February 1905. Baby not at all well, so I sent for the doctor who said he had bronchitis.
3 bouts of bronchitis in less than a year. It seems that Eric Blair's chest ailments began very early. And then there was his other lifelong malady, the desire to write.
I had the lonely child's habit of making up stories and holding conversations with imaginary persons, which created a sort of private world in which I could get my own back for my failure in everyday life.
When he was 8 years old, Eric Blair was sent away to school. It was a private boarding school called St. Cyprian's.
He was a nervous type, really, and I think probably just to be detailed to answer a scripture question at breakfast time would put the wind up him. Indeed, it would anyone, especially if they hadn't done their preparation.
Sir John Grotrian was there at the same time, and he has this picture of the young Eric Blair.
Round, moon-faced, with straight, fair hair.
And not a very interesting boy.
Just deadly dull. There wasn't any loophole where I could get in and make friends.
And years later, when Eric Blair became George Orwell, nothing changed for Sir John.
I never read anything of his, I'm afraid.
Sir John Grotrian remembers his brother and Eric Blair being bullied, almost mobbed by all the other boys.
Whole school booing at them and chasing them and getting them up against the wall of the gymnasium with a view to bashing at them. But what they'd done, I really don't know. I can't think what anyone could have had against him. He was quite harmless. I think probably he was a born bookworm and would have liked to have been left in peace.
Many years after he left St. Cyprian's, George Orwell wrote about the school in an essay. It was called Such Were the Joys. Well, there was a long list of joys.
Sweaty stockings, dirty towels, fecal smells blowing along corridors, forks with old food between the prongs, porridge containing more lumps and hairs and unexplained black things than one would have thought possible.
Add to this the beatings and other physical punishments, and we get a picture of a person defenseless against endless privation and arbitrary power, perhaps like Winston Smith in 1984. But that's not the picture you get if you read young Eric Blair's letters home.
My darling mother, I hope you're all right. Thank you for your letter.
Orwell's niece, Jane Morgan, has several of these letters. This one is dated June the 2nd, 1912.
We have had a magic lantern lecture and a fancy dress dance on Friday. I went to the dance as a footman, with a red velvet coat and a white silk flowered waistcoat and red silk trousers and black stockings and a lace frill and a wig. One of the boys went as a pirate and 3 as revolutionaries. One went as a sunflower, one as Puss in Boots, another as a frog, and one as the White Rabbit in Alice in Wonderland, and a lot of other things.
The letters don't appear to have been censored by the school, but of course it's possible that Eric censored himself, giving his mother a steady diet of good news stories.
I'm 5th in French and English, and 1st in Latin and 2nd in arithmetic. With lots of love from Eric Blair.
Eric was 5 years younger than his older sister and 5 years older than his younger sister, so when he came home for the school holidays, he usually went off looking for friends more of his own age. And that's how he came to meet the 3 children of the Buddicombe family who lived nearby. The first encounter was on a summer day in 1914, and according to the oldest Buddicombe child, Jacintha, it was strange, even comical.
He was in the field, standing on his head very ostentatiously in order to attract our attention, I think, when we were playing French cricket in the field. But anyway, he was upside down, and we said, "What are you doing there, standing on your head?" And he said, "You're noticed more if you stand on your head than if you're right way up." We shall never forget that, because it was such a peculiar thing for somebody to do. And from that very moment, we were permanent friends. Books was what the great thing that was the common denominator. I was never without a book in my hand, and nor was he. So far as literature and so on was concerned, we were more or less twin souls.
The family hoped that after St. Cyprian's, Eric would move on to one of the big prestigious schools. The problem was that they couldn't afford the fees. But Eric was a very bright boy, and he won a scholarship to Eton, where scholarship boys were charged only a quarter of the regular fees. This presumably pleased his parents, but it didn't make the boy happy. Years later, Orwell would paint a picture of a miserable, poor boy at Eton, a victim of snobbery and class consciousness.
That's where I think the legend has got it wrong.
Sir Stephen Runciman was an exact contemporary of Eric Blair at Eton.
That he wasn't this embittered boy at a school where he was the poorest. I knew him always as a rather sardonically cheerful, shall I say, boy. I mean, loving the irony, loving to have a slight grievance against masters of older boys and like that, but enjoying it.
Quizzical, observing.
Christopher Eastwood was also at Eton at that time.
He was more sardonic than rebellious, standing aside from things a bit.
Aloof maybe, but argumentative.
Endless arguments that used to go on about all sorts of things in which he was one of the great leaders.
This is Sir Roger Miners.
I remember when we first were doing Greek, which of course we all did in those days, and we were first introduced to Plato and the method of the Platonic dialogue, in which Socrates argues like anything with a lot of other people, proving them endlessly wrong, really in order to get them thinking. And I will remember the first Platonic dialogue we ever met in our ordinary Greek class. I thought to myself at once, this man's just like Eric Blair.
He was always going to write, and he was always going to be a famous writer in capital letters. That was his idea, when I'm a famous writer, and I used to say, when you're a famous writer. That was his sort of trademark, Eric, the famous writer.
Whenever he came home from Eton, Eric Blair would spend as much time as he could with his friend and soulmate, Jacintha Buddicombe. On Christmas Day, 1918, as the light went down in the late afternoon, they were together in front of a blazing fire.
I was curled up on the fireside seat reading a book, and Eric was writing at the desk.
Writing a sonnet to Jacintha.
Our minds are married, but we're too young for wedlock by the customs of this age. Times past, the caveman by his new-found fire rested beside his mate in wood smoke scent. By our own fireside we shall rest content. 50 years hence keep troth with heart's desire. We shall remember when our hair is white, these clouded days revealed in radiant light. As far as I remember, I think I liked it, though I didn't know that we'd be likely to be resting by our own fireside, because I never had any idea of marrying Eric. I was 2 years older than he was, and I never thought of him in a romantic way at all. But I think that he had, for a child of his age, as romantic a view of me as it was possible for him to have, probably. But it was always highly respectable romance. He never made any attempt to seduce me.
After he left Eton in 1921, Eric would see much less of Jacintha. His family had moved to Southwold. It's a seaside resort on the east coast of England. His father was now retired and living on a government pension. By now, Eric Blair was 18. He was tall and gangly, a strange-looking young man, according to Joan Mullock and Nancy Fox.
Very tall, very thin. He had great skinny hands. His clothes, his trousers were always too short.
His parents were very hard up, but they always put up a jolly good show. They couldn't keep pace with his growing, I suppose. That's really what happened.
He looked so funny to come from Eton somehow. So rough. But he wasn't rough, he was most gentle a creature.
And what would this gentle creature do next? After Eton, the normal thing would be to head off to university, most likely to Oxford. But this was more than his parents could afford. The solution was to send young Eric to the place his father had just left, India.
He used to talk about the East a great deal. I mean, it was a sort of romantic, almost a romantic idea.
Sir Stephen Runciman.
He was born there, and I think it was the sort of the dream of the wonderful life that he had lived.
So India it was. Eric Blair, the gentle creature who loved poetry, wasn't good at sport, and hated the army cadet training that every schoolboy had to go through, would now apply to be a policeman in Imperial India. The entrance exams were tough and highly competitive, but luckily in Southwold there was an ex-India man who knew the ropes, and he put Eric through 6 months of cramming, and the hard work paid off. After the exams there was a medical and a riding test. He got through those as well, and by the fall of 1922, aged 19, Eric Blair was ready to head out for a new life in the Far East. But first he had to get kitted out for the tropics with clothes made to measure by the local gentleman's tailor in Southwold, Denny and Sons.
Now, he was only 37 chest man and 33 waist, but long in the leg, you see, 34 inside leg, which gives you some sort of idea of his build.
Jack Denny has the order books for 1922.
Here we are, E.A. Blair. 2 flannels, 1 pair of cream and 1 pair of grey, and his riding breeches in September 1922, about the Burmese time.
Had expensive buckskin strappings.
We always put buckskin strappings on. Liked his clothes, there's no doubt about it.
Eric Blair left England for Burma on the 27th of October 1922 with a first-class ticket on the British ship SS Herefordshire. Many years later, writing as George Orwell, he would describe how shocked he was to see, one lunchtime,
a quartermaster scurrying like a rat along the side of the deck with a half-eaten custard pudding from the passenger's table partially concealed in his monstrous hands. Here was a highly skilled craftsman who might literally hold all our lives in his hands, stealing scraps of food from our table. It taught me more than I could have learned from half a dozen socialist pamphlets.
Orwell's ship reached Rangoon in November 1922, and from there it was a long train journey up country to the police training school in Mandalay. Lectures in the morning, military drill in the afternoon, and drinking at night.
I don't think that when he first went out, Eric realised how much he'd hated it when he got there.
Jacintha Buddicombe.
I don't know really quite why he did hate it so much when he got there, but anyway he did. He evidently thought it was absolutely frightful.
As a colonial policeman in Burma, Eric Blair was effectively a member of the ruling caste, and he quickly realised that discipline and conformity were the orders of the day, and that meant being very careful about what he wrote.
He did seem very guarded about the way that the British treated the Burmese. It was all sort of, you can't imagine how frightful it was if you hadn't had to go through it yourself. Well, of course, that didn't really convey anything to me at all.
Much later, Orwell would say that what he hated was having to do what he called the dirty work of empire.
I watched a man hang once. It seemed to me worse than 1,000 murders.
He gives us this memorable image of a condemned prisoner, a Burmese man,
turning aside slightly to avoid splashing his feet in a puddle a few yards from the hangman's rope. It's curious, but until that moment I had never realized what it means to destroy a healthy, conscious man.
And in his novel, Burmese Days, Orwell's largely autobiographical main character has this remarkable rant.
In the end, the secrecy of your revolt poisons you like a disease. Your whole life is a life of lies, and the time comes when you burn with hatred of your own countrymen, when you long for a native rising to drown their empire in blood.
When Orwell's character in Burmese Days couldn't stand it any longer, he committed suicide. when after 5 years the young colonial policeman, Eric Blair, couldn't stand it anymore, he quit. In 1927, he applied for sick leave, sailed back to England, and while he was there, he resigned. In another of his essays, Orwell wrote,
"When the white man turns tyrant, it is his own freedom he destroys."
It seems that Eric Blair wanted his freedom back.
You're listening to the Orwell tapes on Ideas, the first of our three-part series on George Orwell. The Orwell tapes is based on an extensive and unique archive of recordings with people who knew Orwell, and it's produced and presented by Steve Wadhams.
I gave up my job partly because the climate in Burma had ruined my health, but mainly because I could not go on any longer serving an imperialism which I had come to regard as very largely a racket.
Eric Blair got back to England in the late summer of 1927. He moved in with his parents in their retirement house in the seaside resort of Southwold.
He did talk about Burma, not a very great deal, but he did.
And he spent a lot of time walking in the countryside with his friend Dennis Collings, who felt that he was hearing the confession of a very troubled man, a guilty man.
He felt that we were oppressing the Burmese. We'd thrust ourselves in there, taken over the government, were not allowing the Burmese to have their say in things, and he was there to enforce that kind of thing against the will of the people.
And what did Eric Blair's father think of his son's resignation? Basically, his rejection of the British Empire and everything it stood for.
I don't somehow think he was very proud of him.
Southwold residents, Joan Mullock and Nancy Fox.
I mean, young men didn't give up jobs in those days. They did what their fathers wanted them to do, more or less. I suppose our parents must have said, fancy giving up a job, fancy coming home, on his parents. And what will he do?
Joan Mullock and Nancy Fox hardly recognized Eric when he came back from Burma.
He was, I don't know, he was very difficult, wasn't he, Eric?
Well, he had socialist ideas, I suppose, hadn't he? You see, and Mr. Blair Sr. wouldn't really agree with that.
His father was very disappointed because he came to England with no money and no future, only this desire to write, and it's very difficult for any young writer to start.
This is Mabel Fearts. She met Eric Blair while she and her husband were visiting Southwold on vacation. Mabel Fearts was happy to give a rather lost-looking young man a sympathetic ear.
They're very conventional in Southwold, and they're mostly retired elderly people who lived there. They were not interested, of course, at all. No one gave him any support.
Eric Blair was willing to tell his friend Dennis Collings how much he hated the British Empire, but when it came to his writing, he kept things very much to himself.
Nobody ever saw him writing anything, because he did that in his little back room in the mornings. He had his breakfast, he went to his little back room, he sat down at a table with a pen and paper, and he wrote. He didn't mind what he wrote at all. He just wrote, regardless of everything else. And this he looked upon as his training for writing more serious matter later on.
And when Eric Blair looked around for a serious subject to write about, he chose poverty. And he believed if you were going to write about something, you had to live the experience first.
He turned himself into an outcast. He was trying to identify himself with those who had lost all interest in living what we would call a reasonably normal life.
He was very much in sympathy with the downtrodden people in this world.
Mabel Fearts.
Well, you could have called it a kind of socialism, but I couldn't describe it. It was a sort of personal feeling of injustice to the underdog.
Coming from a family and social class which never experienced physical hardship and poverty in that sense, he had a sense of guilt about that.
This is Mabel Fiertz's son, Adrian.
And of course one must remember that the poverty in Europe, in Western Europe and England in those days, was something much greater than it is today. You'd have to go to the Third World to see comparable poverty today. So his feeling of guilt and concern about this was understandable.
In the winter of 1927, Eric Blair, the old Etonian and former imperial policeman, headed out onto the streets of the rougher parts of East London to try to pass himself off as a tramp. He decided that with his upper-class accent he couldn't speak like a down-and-out, but he could at least try to look like one. So he sold one of his good suits, bought an old coat, a pair of workman's trousers, a scarf, and a cloth cap.
My new clothes put me instantly into a new world.
On his very first day, he helped a man whose barrow had overturned. The man grinned and said, "Thanks, mate." Orwell wrote with pride,
"No one had ever called me mate in my life."
Orwell found a room for the night in a rough-looking lodging house.
A boy led me up a rickety staircase to a room where the windows were tight shut and the air was suffocating and reeking of foul linen.
A room 15 feet square with 8 beds in it, 6 of them already occupied by fellow lodgers.
Queer, lumpy shapes with their clothes and boots piled on top of them. In one corner, someone was coughing in a loathsome manner.
For Eric Blair, it was the beginning of a new life. For his friend Dennis Collings, it seemed like an exercise in masochism.
Cold, hungry, miserable, shoes worn out, nothing to keep the rain off, extreme discomfort. It can only be self-punishment. There can be no other answer.
When he couldn't stand it any longer, he would head back home to his friends in Southwold for a quick clean-up.
He just turned up looking like a tramp. So he said, "You go up and have a bath." Just came in for breakfast and then went off being a tramp again.
Brenda Salkeld was a teacher in Southwold and very sceptical about her friend's sudden plunge into the world of the poor and downtrodden.
It's very different if you are really no money and you're being a tramp and you haven't got anywhere to go. It's very different to that from someone who just plays at being a tramp. I used to argue this with him. I said, "You don't know anything about it, what it feels like to be a tramp."
Oh, no, I never took his tramping seriously. I looked upon it as an anthropological experience that he wanted to go through, leading to something that could be written about.
When he was on the road, Orwell would write long letters to Dennis Collings.
He would, very often, I don't say always, but usually, say, "Please let me have a return stamp." Which was very, very laughable, really. Because supposing he really had run out of money, quite genuinely, "Could you let me have a fiver?" I would have willingly have let him have a fiver, you see. But no, there was nothing like that.
When he thought he had enough for a book, Eric Blair went back to his parents' house and wrote up his experiences as a down-and-out and sent them off to a publisher. But the manuscript was rejected. "Too short," said the publisher. "You need more." So in the spring of 1928, he took his search for poverty across the English Channel to Paris.
He got a job in a hotel in Paris to wash up in the kitchen, washing up and helping in the kitchen.
The kitchen was like nothing I had ever seen or imagined. A filthy, stifling inferno.
A noisy inferno, too, with the clanging of pots and pans and the shouting and cursing of his fellow workers. And the food didn't get much respect either.
A French cook is an artist, but his art is not cleanliness. When a steak was brought to the head cook for inspection, he would pick it up in his fingers, slap it down, run his thumb round the dish to taste the gravy, and then press it lovingly into place with his fat pink fingers.
And this was the kitchen of one of the best hotels in Paris.
In the cheap restaurants, it's different. There, the same trouble isn't taken over the food. It's just forked out of the pan and flung onto the plate without handling. The more one pays for food, the more sweat and spittle one is obliged to eat with it.
Eric Blair found a room in a cheap hotel in one of the slums of Paris.
The rooms were small and dirty, and the walls were as thin as matchwood. Near the ceiling, long lines of bugs marched all day like columns of soldiers, and at night they came down and were ravenously hungry.
He got pneumonia there, and he was in the hospital there for a time.
An experience that would lead years later to one of his finest essays, How the Poor Die.
And then he had a girlfriend, and he got very fond of her, and he and this girl were living together, and he was proposing to marry her, which would have been very foolish. But one day he came home and he found that she'd gone, and with all his clothes and all his luggage. She just disappeared, so that was the end of that girl.
Eric Blair spent 18 months in Paris, and by the fall of 1929 he was back in England and out tramping again to get more material. By October 1930 he had a new and larger manuscript. He spent a whole year revising and fine-tuning it. Then he picked a different publisher from the one who'd rejected his first draft and sent it off. But again it was rejected. It was a huge blow, and he poured out his troubles to his friends Mabel Fearts and her husband.
He was very disappointed. He said, I can't get it published, so he said, throw it away.
Throw it away and keep the paper clips, at least those have some value, was apparently what a defeated and depressed Eric Blair said that day. Here he was, nearly 30, and still with no book to his name, probably wondering how it had come to this. Where was the confident Eric the famous writer of his childhood? Meanwhile, of course, he needed money to keep body and soul together, and in April 1932 he did what so many other struggling writers have done. He took a teaching job. The school was in a dreary suburb of London, and it was hardly a school at all, just a pair of houses joined together. He wrote to one of his friends,
"This is one of the most God-forsaken places I have ever been in."
You would have thought by the tone of his letters that he actually hated us boys, but I think it was his manner of writing rather than his actual feelings.
One of the boys was Geoffrey Stevens.
Without a shadow of a doubt, he was by far and away the finest teacher that we had then. He it was who gave me my first lesson in oil painting, setting up small objects like eggs and matchboxes on a table and showing me how to produce the perspective and give light and shade and how to give roundness to the form of an egg in oils. He used to do quite a bit of oil painting at that time. I think he could be interested in almost any subject. His essays certainly bear that out, don't they?
Geoffrey Stevens remembers a tall, somewhat eccentric teacher.
He was a man who lived within himself. He would suddenly begin to smile. His face would become completely wrinkled with smiles. He wouldn't utter a sound. Obviously something was going through his mind all the time. He was full of recollections, but to my knowledge he never divulged to anyone what was going through his thoughts, whether it was a theme for his new books or something that happened in the kitchens in Paris or when he was hobnobbing with the tramps. No one will ever know, I think.
While he was at the school, Eric Blair got some life-changing news. His manuscript about the downtrodden in Paris and London had finally found a publisher. Third time lucky.
My husband and I thought that he was a good writer, that he deserved help.
But it wasn't luck. Mabel Fearts hadn't thrown Orwell's rejected manuscript away, as he told her to.
My husband knew a literary agent, and so one day I thought, well, I'll take this manuscript and see. And he said, oh no, nobody knows your friend, I'm afraid there's no hope. So I persuaded him, I said, well, keep it and look at it yourself and see if you can do anything. 3 months after, he sold it to Gollancz, and Gollancz brought it out.
Victor Gollancz, the publisher, wanted the book to be called The Confessions of a Down and Out. But Eric Blair didn't like that title, and of course we all know what they finally agreed on. The other thing they had to agree on was what name should be on the cover. Eric Blair didn't want to use his real name because, says Adrian Fearts,
he thought that his conventional parents and their friends and relations would be upset at the revelations of the disreputable life he'd led with tramps and down and outs in Paris and London.
Adrian's mother, Mabel Fearts, thought it was more to do with the possibility that the book would be a financial embarrassment.
He thought that if his book was an absolute failure, he didn't want the name Blair, his father's name, to be thought it badly of. So that's why he changed his name.
But what name to choose?
The story goes that he and my father were walking in Suffolk, and he said, "What name shall I use as a nom de plume?" And the River Orwell was nearby, and so father said, "Why not take Orwell as the surname?" And then he said, "What Christian name?" And my father, always as a sort of joke, talking to a child or something that he met in a train or something like that, would say, "Hello, George," just as Americans say "Hello, Mac," very often to a stranger. And so father said, "Well, make it George."
It still wasn't a done deal. As the final manuscript was almost ready for the printer, Eric Blair wrote to his agent,
"As to a pseudonym, a name I always use when I go tramping is P.S. Burton."
And in case his agent didn't like that name, he offered 3 more.
What about Kenneth Miles, H. Lewis Always, or George Orwell? I rather favor George Orwell.
And so on January the 9th, 1933, a new book by a new author went on sale. Down and Out in Paris and London by George Orwell. And now the confusion began. Family and old friends called him Eric, new friends called him George. The name change led to a great deal of speculation. Was it simply to avoid embarrassing his family, or to give him a chance to start again with a different name if the book was a failure? John Kimchi believes there was more to it than that.
The fact that he created Orwell, he not only assumed the name, but he also assumed the persona. And I think gradually that persona swallowed up Eric Blair as well.
Orwell had submerged himself in the lives of the lowest of the low, hoping that he could start over, reinvent himself, and escape his privileged class background. But it wasn't as easy as he thought.
You don't solve the class problem by making friends with tramps. You can become a tramp by putting on the right clothes. But when you come to the normal working class, there is no shortcut. The position is totally different. With the normal working class, the curse of class difference confronts you like a wall of stone.
And a wall of ignorance.
I had no notion that the working class were human beings.
I don't think he was able to identify himself with the British working men. He would have liked to have done so, but he couldn't.
Adrian Fearts.
His interests were intellectual. They weren't. He wasn't interested in racing or greyhounds or pub crawling and so on. He just hadn't much in common with the people who hadn't got his intellectual interests. He simply felt that he didn't know what to talk about.
It's an assessment shared by Orwell's niece, Jane Morgan.
I think there was a certain amount of feeling between him and my father. My father was hail fellow, well met, you see, and he reckoned that if Eric was a socialist, he ought to get on well with the working man, you know, with all and sundry. And Eric didn't really have a great line in small talk. So I think there was this kind of, ha, he's a socialist, you see, but he doesn't get on as well as I do with the working man.
Writing a book is a horrible, exhausting struggle. One would never undertake such a thing if one were not driven on by some demon whom one can neither resist nor understand.
At this time in his life, Orwell's main demon was guilt at what he had seen and done in his 5 years as a policeman in Burma.
The subordinates I had bullied and aged peasants I had snubbed, the servants and coolies I had hit with my fist in moments of rage, all this haunted me intolerably.
If Down and Out in Paris and London was his journalistic attempt to expunge the guilt, the literary expression came in his first novel, Burmese Days. Adrian Fearts.
Somebody had compared it to E.M. Forster's A Passage to India. And Eric, with typical modesty, had said, "Oh no, you can't possibly compare my poor effort of Burmese Days to a masterpiece like that." And at the time, I accepted that, but since then, I'm not sure. I don't think it's just as good, in fact, if not some ways a better book than A Passage to India.
In Burmese Days, Orwell wanted to convince his readers that empire was morally wrong, and that the British Empire was rotten, or at least rotting, and that the British in India were not just oppressors, but dull in their oppression.
A dull, decent people, cherishing and fortifying their dullness behind 250,000 bayonets.
The main character is a timber merchant by the name of John Florey, and much of the action centres around the English Club, a claustrophobic little white man's world.
Where every word and every thought is censored. Free speech is unthinkable. You are a creature of despotism, tied tighter than a monk or a savage by an unbreakable system of taboos.
John Florey in Burmese Days, Winston Smith in 1984, both are lonely misfits living a solitary double life, and both try to rebel against the forces that surround them, and both fail. The tyrannical force in Burmese Days was the British Empire, and Orwell's critique was savage and direct, and it scared his publisher, Victor Gollancz.
Gollancz wouldn't publish that because he said it was too critical of the establishment.
Victor Gollancz was afraid that influential people would take legal action, so Burmese Days was first published abroad, in the United States, in October 1934. But when the libel suits failed to materialize, Gollancz grew a little braver, and the English edition appeared in 1935. But by then, Orwell had suffered another serious bout of pneumonia, bad enough to force him to give up teaching. He was making ends meet, just, with a part-time job.
A very simple job in a bookshop. He didn't care for it very much, but it was a job. It gave him enough to live on.
The job came with a rented room.
And he had enough to pay for the room and to feed himself.
I never saw him sit in the bookshop. It was curious. He always seemed to stand there in the centre, almost slightly forbidding figure.
John Kimchi worked the mornings in the bookshop, and Orwell worked the afternoons.
Probably like myself, he resented the idea of selling anything to people as being slightly subservient, even books. What interested me was when we used to sit there in the evenings, the conversation almost invariably went over to Roman Catholicism and its influence on public life, and I had the impression that was one of his strong anti-feelings at the time. Curiously, he never discussed socialism, he never discussed current politics. He would never discuss his books with anybody. He was quite paranoid about that.
Perhaps because the book he was working on at that time was about a bookshop. His main character, a sad sack of a man by the name of Gordon Comstock, opens with this sour diatribe.
800 strong, the novels lined the room. Gordon eyed them with inert hatred. Horrible to think of all that soggy, half-baked trash massed together in one place. Pudding. 800 slabs of pudding walling him in. A vault of pudding stone.
Orwell called this book Keep the Aspidistra Flying. It was a joke, a dig at bourgeois values, at people desperately trying to keep up appearances by putting aspidistras, a tough, leathery, potted plant, all around the house. Keep the Aspidistra Flying was Orwell's third novel, and it was published in April 1936.
To tell you the truth, when the book first came out and I started to read it, I read about 10 pages and then put it away. It just seemed to me so way out. And Orwell was then not sort of necessary reading, in order to be accepted in polite society. So I really didn't read it. It seemed all wrong. It sounded false. It just didn't ring true to me.
In Keep the Aspidistra Flying, Orwell follows his rant about soggy, half-baked books with a rant about money. His character, Gordon Comstock, who's written one small book of poetry, quickly remaindered, never has a penny to his name and is jealous of anyone who does.
You need money for the right kind of education, money for influential friends. If you don't have money, women won't love you. Without money, you are unlovable.
Well, maybe not quite.
We were just very good friends, you know. Well, say we were fond of each other.
This is Kay Eckerval. She used to come into the bookshop where Orwell worked. Kay shared Orwell's left-wing sympathies and considered herself a modern and progressive woman.
I mean, in those days, of course, most of my women friends weren't interested in looking for marriage or anything like that. We rather despised marriage, you know. I think he liked women well enough. I mean, he was always very nice to you and this kind of thing, but I don't think he ever really regarded them as a force in life. They were very secondary. We did discuss children once or twice. I said, did he ever want any? Not that I wanted any by him, but I mean, just in general conversation, you know. And he said, oh, I don't think I can have any. I said, why do you say that? And he thought a moment and then he says, well, I've never had any, you know. So I felt like, I didn't say it at the time, I felt like saying, well, how do you know? You know, you might have, and they'd never let on, you know.
Kay Eckerval and Orwell would often go for long walks.
A lot of walks we went on.
Sometimes in the countryside, well away from London, but usually on Hampstead Heath, an oasis of green only a few miles from the centre of the city.
He knew an awful lot about the countryside, of course he'd been brought up in more countryside surroundings than I had. He'd stop now and again and say, oh, listen, and he'd tell me what bird it was that was singing, and different trees. I would say to him, what tree is that? And he would always know, which is fascinating to me. I always enjoy people like that. I've met a few that have what I call country eyes, you know.
In the spring of 1935, Orwell's eyes had turned from Kay to another young woman.
Most of my boyfriends, I used to say, oh, well, look, if you find someone else, don't hesitate to say so, because I don't like these dragged out things, you know. And I said the same to Eric, and actually he was the only one that ever said, I've found someone else. Eric was the only one that said, look, I've met a girl I want to marry.
On Ideas, you heard The Orwell Tapes, the first of our three-part series on George Orwell. The series is produced and presented by Steve Wadhams. Excerpts from Orwell's books, essays, and letters were read by Graham Wright. In the next episode, we follow Orwell as he sets out to investigate poverty in the north of England, returns to marry the love of his life, and then risks it all by going off to fight in the Spanish Civil War, an experience which would inspire him to write his most famous books, Animal Farm and 1984. You can find out more about this series and George Orwell on our website at cbc.ca/ideas. And of course, you can find us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. Technical production by Dave Field. This is Ideas. I'm Paul Kennedy, with the second of our three-part series on George Orwell. In the summer of 1983, in the run-up to George Orwell's fateful year, CBC producer Steve Wadhams traveled through England, Scotland, and Spain, interviewing Orwell's family members, his friends, and his critics, people who knew Orwell from his earliest days to his final hours.
He was a nervous type, really.
Always worrying and always typing.
He was a man who lived within himself.
He had a loving heart, although he didn't find it easy to show it.
Parts of this treasure trove of oral history were included in George Orwell, A Radio Biography, which aired on CBC Radio on January 1st, 1984. But much of it is being aired now for the first time. The first episode traced Orwell's strange journey from privilege to poverty and showed how the schoolboy from Eton became a colonial policeman in Burma.
I don't know really quite why he did hate it so much when he got there, but anyway he did.
And why, after he returned to England, racked with guilt at what he'd seen and done at the dirty end of empire, as he called it, he decided to immerse himself in the lives of the lowest of the low.
He turned himself into an outcast. It can only be self-punishment. There can be no other answer.
It also showed how a child-born Eric Blair became the man called George Orwell.
He not only assumed the name, but he also assumed the persona. And I think that persona swallowed up Eric Blair as well.
In this second episode, we follow Orwell as he sets out to investigate poverty in the industrial towns of northern England, returns to marry the love of his life, and then risks it all by going off to fight in the Spanish Civil War. Spain gave Orwell a belief in socialism and a hatred of communism. What he saw in Spain would inspire him to write his most famous books, Animal Farm and 1984. So, welcome to the Orwell Tapes, produced and presented by Steve Wadhams. Episode 2, To Write and to Fight.
One of the things I admire about Orwell is that he never flinched from doing the dirty work. If he wanted to write about the life of a coal miner in the depressed industrial towns of northern England, he went down a coal mine, even though his chest was weak and the coal dust inflamed his lungs. And he lived with the people he was writing about, as a lodger in a cheap boarding house or as a guest in the home of a working-class family. I know those homes well. My mother was from the north of England, and when I went to visit relatives, I'd often be taken down long cobblestone streets, past row upon row of small brick houses. When you went inside, the rooms were cramped and stuffy, but I was a visitor, so I was ushered into the parlour, the front room. A sofa, perhaps a chair or two, some family photos, and usually a few family treasures locked away in a glass cabinet. Orwell didn't write much about these neat, respectable little rooms, and that irritated many working people who wanted him to see how hard they were trying to stay clean and decent in the face of mass poverty and unemployment. He was criticized for seeking out the dirty and the sordid, and many of his friends said that he exaggerated or oversimplified or just took too many liberties with the facts. But Orwell was a political writer. He wanted to make a point, to expose injustice, to get action. If what he wrote was, as he put it, essentially true, well, it met the test.
From a very early age, I knew that when I grew up, I should be a writer. Between the ages of about 17 and 24, I tried to abandon this idea, but I did so with the consciousness that I was outraging my true nature, and that sooner or later I should have to settle down and write books.
And now, in 1935, Eric Blair, now known as George Orwell, had published 3 books. He'd also met the woman he wanted to marry. Her name was Eileen O'Shaughnessy.
Eileen was very attractive.
Lydia Jackson was a close friend of Eileen at that time.
She had dark hair and blue eyes, and her eyes could laugh.
Eileen was an Oxford grad.
This is Mabel Fearts.
And she was doing very valuable work in psychology. And she met him and they fell in love. And he was very happy. That was the only time in his life when he was really happy.
Mabel Fearts saw it as a love match. Lydia Jackson did not.
I was always sorry that Eileen married George. Very doubtful that she was, so to speak, in love with him. I think it must have been his outspokenness. He talked in a way that intrigued her, interested her, because he was an unusual person.
I'd met Eileen once or twice, And she was a lovely person.
This is Orwell's former girlfriend, Kay Eckervall.
Much more his level. She was older than me, been to the university, and she had very much a sort of intellectual standing in her own right, which I thought was rather tragic that she should give it all up, you know.
But Eileen didn't give up the independence of a single life immediately because Orwell felt that he just wasn't making enough money to get married. He wrote to a friend,
"She is the nicest person I have met for a long time. However, alas, I can't afford a ring, except perhaps a Woolworths one."
But then, in January 1936, out of the blue, everything changed. Orwell's publisher, Victor Gollancz, commissioned him to write a book about poverty and unemployment in the industrial towns of the north of England. And he offered Orwell an advance that was roughly twice what he was used to living on for an entire year. Orwell set off for the north at the end of January 1936, and typically he did not take the easy route. He did about half the journey by train, but for much of the rest of the way he walked or he took short bus rides.
February 3rd, 1936. Frightfully cold, bitter wind, blackened snow, and labyrinths of tiny blackened houses. Signs of poverty everywhere.
Eventually, he reached the town of Wigan.
The landscape is mostly slag heaps, looking like the mountains of the moon.
He could have found a clean place to stay with any number of working-class families, but instead he chose squalid lodgings in a room above a tripe shop. Tripe is made from the stomach of an animal, and it was a popular and cheap dish at the time.
My bed was in the corner near the door. There was another bed jammed hard against it, so I had to sleep with my legs doubled up.
When he headed out to begin his research, one of the first people he met was a man who sold books in Wigan Market, Sidney Smith.
This stranger came along who did not know my name, tall, 6 foot plus gentleman, rather a shabby raincoat and a dilapidated trilby hat. He spoke a different accent to us. I mean, we're Lancashire, northern, and he spoke more in a more cultured voice. He asked us what our jobs was and what we were doing, and would we be fully employed, and was we any unemployed, and we were drawing unemployment pay. We thought this person would speak questions about our activities was a snooper for the government.
Some people in Wigan complained that Orwell gave their town a bad name with his descriptions of poverty and degradation, but Sidney Smith is not one of them.
Oh, there was no question. I think he did his homework very well. I know of cases of where children would wait outside factory gates for any bread that the factory girls had left, and they would give them to them.
I'd only seen him signing the visitors' book.
Orwell's research included many hours in the Wigan Public Library, going through back numbers of local newspapers.
My assistant came and pointed out to me. She said, "You know him, don't you?"
At that time, Carlton Melling was the chief librarian.
I said, I don't know him. I know of him, but I said, it's very interesting to have this signature in our book. And he looked as somebody who'd seen a higher culture. He knew how to use books. He knew what he wanted to find in a book. I thought, we don't often see this kind of man in here.
What Carlton Melling was seeing that winter of 1936 was more and more unemployed miners coming into the library just to keep warm.
If they were coming in staggering or anything like that, we did our best to discourage them. But unless they were interfering with other readers or anything like that, we more or less welcomed them.
Carlton Melling could offer a place of refuge for an unemployed man, but he couldn't offer them food.
Yes, there was hunger. Oh, it was common, yes. And I know what hunger was in our own family. My father was a drunkard. He would drink every penny that came in. My mother brought up 13 children, and I don't think I ever had a penny from public assistance or anything like that.
1 room up and 2 downstairs. Living room 13 feet by 8 feet.
Orwell made many house inspections, and he kept detailed notes.
Walls coming apart and water coming in. 10 in the family, with 8 children very near in age. The city is trying to evict them for overcrowding, but cannot find another house to send them to.
Many houses were called back-to-backs, 2 houses joined together. One faced the street, and the other had a view of the outdoor toilets.
In open backyards, there might be 12 families round a more or less open sewer. The stench was horrible, primitive, foul conditions.
And then there were the conditions underground, in the coal mines. Miners were only paid for the time spent actually hacking coal, and before they even got to the coalface, they usually had to travel for sometimes an hour through tunnels, often with a headroom of 4 feet or less, and Orwell was tall, well over 6 feet.
You not only have to bend double, you also have to keep your head up to see the beams and girders and dodge them when they come.
On one journey underground, Orwell did not dodge them, and for a short while he was flat out, unconscious.
I must have bashed my head 20 times, once hard enough to bring down a huge chunk of stone.
Mining was tough, it was dangerous, and there were frequent accidents.
Pit disasters, yes. All too many. There was one in what was called the Maypole pit, and a wrong signal was given. The pit cage with 9 or 10 men just plunged to the bottom. A fearful death.
Death could be quick, or it could come slowly from years of breathing in coal dust.
My father died a miner. He couldn't breathe, and my mother used to stay down with him on the rug in front room. One could hear him in the night retching himself to pieces almost.
Orwell gave his book a catchy title, The Road to Wigan Pier. But there was no pier in Wigan.
On one of the muddy canals, there used to be a tumble-down wooden jetty, about 20 feet long, and someone nicknamed it Wigan Pier as a joke.
The book is in 2 very different halves. The first is full of graphic descriptions of working-class life. The second part of the book is analysis and opinion.
The English working class have grown servile with a horrifying rapidity. The frightful weapon of unemployment has cowed them into submission.
I think he tended to exaggerate people's downtroddenness, rather than their fighting back.
Kay Eckerval.
When I went up to Scotland, I was mixing more with industrial workers and this kind of thing. And, of course, the hunger marches and people like that. And I saw them fighting back, whereas he tends to slide over that.
Orwell was becoming a political writer, and he wanted change. And his recipe for change was, in a word, socialism.
Socialists don't claim to be able to make the world perfect. They claim to be able to make it better. Every empty belly is an argument for socialism.
But if there were so many empty bellies, why, he wondered, was socialism in Britain not leaping up like wildfire to wipe out injustice and class privilege? His answer to that question would make him the friend of socialism that many socialists felt they would rather do without.
There is this horrible prevalence of cranks wherever socialists are gathered together. A dreary tribe of high-minded women and sandal wearers and bearded fruit juice drinkers who come flocking to the smell of progress like bluebottles to a dead cat.
Sex maniacs is one of them. Quakers, pacifists, fruit juice drinkers, bearded fruit juice drinkers. Absolutely ridiculous. He claimed to sort of be rooting for socialism, but he's so anti-socialist that it doesn't come across. Now, you can't tell me that he wasn't intelligent enough to know that. And even if he wasn't, it was pointed out to him by his friends, and he still went on doing it,
Orwell was scathing about middle-class socialists, but he was also dismayed to find in his travels in the north of England that most of the people he met there had a very limited understanding of socialism.
To the working man you'd meet in any pub on a Saturday night, socialism doesn't mean much more than better wages and shorter hours. No working man grasps its deeper implications.
Orwell's politics could be confusing. In his early days, he'd called himself a Tory anarchist, and now he seemed to be a socialist who didn't like socialists. One of his friends said that deep down he was, quote, a radical conservative who valued the old concept of England based on the English countryside, in which to be conservative is to be against any change that leads to inequality. In his books and in his life, Orwell seemed to look at the natural world as a refuge from the modern machine society that he despised and feared. So maybe it's not surprising that in April 1936, when he got back from the noise and the grime of the north, he moved into a cottage in a small village to live amid farmers' fields and the sound of birds.
This then is George Orwell's cottage, originally a medieval cottage.
Esther Brooks moved into the cottage in 1948, not long after Orwell gave up the lease.
Here we have a stretch of ground where he kept his chickens and Millie the goat.
And he had his goat in the back garden.
One of the villagers, Fred Bates, used to help him milk it.
That's when I used to learn to milk, yes. On Orwell's goat, yes.
Orwell put a vegetable garden at the back, and at the front of the cottage he put in a rose bush.
He bought it for sixpence at Woolworths and planted it. We also still have some of his hollyhocks, a rambler, and the loganberry is his.
Wallington was only an hour north of London, but it felt like stepping back in time. There was a village pub and a small church, even a village green with common land for people to graze animals. It was the kind of place where people of different social classes could rub along reasonably well, and maybe that was also part of its appeal for Orwell. Orwell's cottage had once been the village store. It had been closed for a year by the time he got there, and he decided to reopen it.
I'm not sure how one gets in touch with wholesalers, but I suppose it isn't more complicated than a bookshop. I have to tidy up and repaint, but I should be ready to open in about 3 weeks. I have bought a new bacon slicer.
There were shelves all round the room on which he kept his groceries and what have you, and I still found when I came in 48 the old bacon slicer.
Yes, no end of bacon. We had bacon there because Grandma Hatchett used to have her bacon from there.
Fred Bates has fond memories of the bacon that George Orwell sold.
Beautiful bacon you used to have on there. Sugar and everything else you used to buy from there. Yeah.
There was a very tiny pantry here. I don't think it could have kept the food in very good order. George Orwell had a very tiny sink there, which never worked. And the door which connects to the shop is noted because there are slits in the top, so that when he was sitting in his sitting room, he could look through the squint to see if there's anybody in the shop.
When she moved in, Esther Brooks found more than blocked sinks and bacon slicers.
There was quite a lot of correspondence, but it had been left lying on the floor among his boots and scraps, and it really had disintegrated over the years, and I just had to burn it.
Soon, Orwell would be a writer, a shopkeeper, and a married man. On the morning of June the 9th, 1936, in the little village church, Orwell married Eileen O'Shaughnessy.
She went in the first gate, up the steps.
This is Fred Bates's wife, Olga.
Walked down the path, he ran round, jumped over the other gate and met her at the porch, and they both went in together to get married.
It wouldn't be long before Eileen and George got visitors, usually friends from London, like journalist Patricia Donahue. She met Eileen for the first time at the cottage.
I liked her immediately. She was a very attractive person, you know. She had a very good figure and a roundish face, and she had a good sense of humour. She was rather given to telling funny stories. And telling funny stories about George, too, sometimes. Slightly exaggerated stories, sometimes, about their life. George, I don't think, was an easy man to live with, I shouldn't imagine at all. But they did get on, I think, quite well. I think it was a happy marriage, really.
Or it became a happy marriage. In a letter to a friend, Eileen wrote,
"During our first few weeks together, we quarrelled continuously."
Eileen didn't share Orwell's appetite for discomfort, and the cottage had no electricity, cold water only, and an outside privy.
I cried all the time from exhaustion.
But the unhappiness was short-lived. It seems that in the face of criticism from interfering relatives, the newlyweds took a united stand, and after that,
all our troubles were over.
But not for long. A month later, dramatic and far-reaching effects abroad changed everything. On July 17, 1936, Spanish generals rebelled against an elected left-wing government and marched on Madrid. One of the key players was General Francisco Franco, who was a former director of Spain's military academy. Most outside observers thought it would be a quick coup d'etat, but it turned out to be a long and bitter civil war. Orwell followed it very closely, and by the end of 1936, he'd made up his mind.
I'm going to Spain. This fascism, somebody's got to stop it.
He saw it clearly as the beginning of a fascist conflict. Franco supported by Hitler, supported by Mussolini.
Fenner Brockway helped Orwell to get a letter of reference which he could use when he got to Spain.
I remember his saying that it would be an experience which would probably result in a book, but he intended to fight. There was no doubt about that.
Most of the foreigners who went to fight in Spain joined the International Brigade, which was engaged in fierce fighting defending Madrid against Franco's army. The International Brigade was getting most of its weapons and support from Stalin's Soviet Union, but Fenner Brockway had given Orwell an introduction to people in Barcelona, and here he linked up with a group called the Workers' Party for Marxist Unity. It was heavily influenced by Leon Trotsky, and this would lead to all kinds of trouble for Orwell, because Trotsky and Stalin were sworn enemies. Soon after Orwell got to Barcelona, he was given a tour of the city and an introduction to the complexities of the Civil War by a young journalist, Victor Alba.
I had the feeling that he didn't know very much about Spain. He had not a big background.
Victor Alba was surprised by Orwell's apparent lack of revolutionary enthusiasm.
He did not ask anything specially. He just followed me. He was fairly silent. I had the feeling that he was bored. You have to remember that I was a kid, expecting from people as much enthusiasm and as much knowledge as I had, because for me, the Civil War was my life.
Later, when Victor Alba read Orwell's book, Homage to Catalonia, his opinion changed completely.
I could say that Orwell got the feeling of the country, catch the mood, and the basic psychological facts of the Spaniards and the Catalans at that time.
Much better than Arthur Koestler in his book on the Spanish Civil War.
Much less perceptive than Orwell. Much less.
And much less self-centered than Ernest Hemingway's book.
Hemingway's Spain is just Hemingway. It's no Spain.
The day before I joined the militia, I saw a tough-looking youth with powerful shoulders, gazing with a puzzled frown at a map that was lying open on the table.
The map was in Spanish, and the young militiaman was Italian. And when he realized that Orwell was also a foreigner, he reached out and gripped his hand. It was a tiny moment, but Orwell would never forget it.
It was as though his spirit and mine had bridged the gulf of language and tradition and were meeting in utter intimacy.
In Barcelona, Orwell was amazed to see how the old power structure, army, church, landowner, had been swept aside.
It was the first time I had ever been in a town where the working class were in the saddle.
Workers had seized factories, peasants had taken over the land, and churches had been closed and sometimes looted.
In some ways, I didn't like it, but I recognized it immediately as a state of affairs worth fighting for.
He wrote to a friend,
I have seen wonderful things here, and at last really believe in socialism, which I never did before.
You're listening to The Orwell Tapes on Ideas, the second of our three-part series on George Orwell. The series is based on a unique archive of interviews with people who knew Orwell. It's produced and presented by Steve Wadhams.
Orwell would never forget what he saw in those first few weeks in Barcelona.
Waiters and shopwalkers looked you in the face and treated you as an equal. Tipping was forbidden. All private cars had been commandeered. Almost everyone wore rough working-class clothes. The wealthy had practically ceased to exist.
A real socialist, libertarian country.
Bob Edwards was another Englishman who'd gone to Spain to fight against General Franco's army.
The owners of factories had left to go over to Franco, and the workers had to take over the factories. The large landowners were always absentee landowners, so the land was allocated to the peasants, and cooperatives were formed. The hotels were taken over and councils were set up. There was workers' control throughout the whole of Catalonia. And there was equality of income. Everybody received 10 pesetas a day. The general, the woman sweeping the streets in Barcelona, 10 pesetas. It was a marvellous country to be in for socialists. It was worth fighting for.
Orwell believed he had finally broken through the shell of his class alienation, and he was witnessing in tiny microcosm not just a classless society, but a concrete example of socialism in action. But he wasn't so pleased to discover that the military action would be in the hands of a ragtag army of raw recruits.
Mostly boys from the back streets of Barcelona, full of revolutionary ardor, but completely ignorant of the meaning of war.
Orwell was shocked to find that there just weren't enough guns to go around.
Men were being sent into the line with only a few days' training, and in many cases without ever having fired a rifle.
Probably because of his police background in Burma, Orwell was asked to help, together with another English volunteer, Frank Frankfurt.
We did the British military training of advancing and throwing yourself down and firing, then running forward and throwing yourself down again. And this highly amused these Spanish militia who were around us at the time. They said, "Oh, you don't lay down to fire, you stand up and fire." And they thought this was most amusing. In fact, so prevalent was this idea that you just stood up and fired at your enemy that they issued leaflets that I saw where it showed bullets coming through the air, and if a man was standing up, they were going to hit him. If he was laying on the ground, they were going over his head. And it was as crude as this.
After endless delays and rumours, suddenly, with 2 hours' notice, Orwell's militia was given orders to go to the front. Bob Edwards was Orwell's commanding officer, and he remembers going over to Orwell's dugout and being greeted by a tall man, dressed up, he said, like something out of a comic opera.
Because there was this big man, you know, with huge muddy boots, the biggest boots I'd ever seen. And he had this scarf round his neck up to his eyes. He had an old Winchester rifle on his shoulder and 2 hand grenades hanging from his belt. I couldn't help but laugh.
Bob Edwards remembers one occasion when both sides were preparing for an attack and everything was quiet, and Orwell decided to shoot a rat in his dugout.
And the noise vibrated all over the front. And the fascists thought, oh, this is the attack, you see. Bloody shells came over. Bombing planes came at us. They blew up our canteen and blew up our buses and everything. It was a very costly shot at the rat, that was.
But Bob Edwards was very impressed with Orwell's courage. More than once, when they were running short of food, Orwell risked his life crawling out over the fields to collect potatoes.
I wouldn't go myself. I thought it was reckless, you see, and I wouldn't let anybody else go, but he went.
Orwell had calculated that if he kept very close to the ground, the enemy machine guns couldn't hit him.
And he was right. The machine gun couldn't get him, you see.
While he was at the Aragon front, Orwell's book, The Road to Wigan Pier, was published. His publisher sent out some copies, and Orwell handed them out for the men to read during quiet times in the trenches. Frank Frankfurt read the book and was outraged.
I took great exception to what he said about the workers in there.
What Orwell had written was this.
The real secret of class distinctions is summed up in 4 frightful words which were bandied about freely when I was a child. The lower classes smell. That's what we were taught. The lower classes smell.
Frank Frankfurt interpreted this as an attack on people like himself.
He had this middle-class public school outlook. Anybody who was poor stunk.
To Frank Frankfurt, Orwell's educated accent was irritating and condescending. But another working-class Englishman who'd come to fight in Spain, Stafford Cotman, found Orwell's voice compelling and reassuring.
When he spoke, whether it was the rather Oxford accent, this was a thing that somehow made you listen. You had respect for him. I think it's true to say he was a sort of natural leader.
Orwell spent 115 days in the trenches, and then in April 1937 he was given leave to go back down the line to Barcelona. He was looking forward to seeing his wife Eileen, who'd come out to Spain a couple of months earlier.
George is here on leave.
She wrote to her brother in England.
He arrived completely ragged, almost barefoot, and looking very well.
Eileen also wrote that Orwell wanted to leave Barcelona and go to Madrid, where the real action was.
So I said to him, you bloody scribbler, you don't know what this war is all about.
Orwell's commanding officer, Bob Edwards.
If he'd gone to Madrid, there was one thing certain, he'd have been killed. Because in Madrid, there was a murderous commissar, Andrew Mate, a Frenchman, who was in political commissar for the whole of the international brigades. And if anybody had criticism of the war effort or had any Trotskyist tendencies, that's what they called them, if you were opposed to something that was being done, you it must be a Trotskyist, he'd have been court-martialed and shot.
One event changed Orwell's mind. On May the 3rd, 1937, fighting broke out between anti-Franco forces for control of the Barcelona telephone exchange. It was partly an external feud, Trotsky versus Stalin, playing out in Spain. It was also partly rooted in a very practical argument about how to win the war. Should social equality, the revolution, come after the war was won, or was it the only way to win the war?
We thought that this wasn't an ordinary war.
Bob Edwards.
It was a social revolution. And if the social revolution was halted and we went back to the old game of inequality, we would lose the war because the people would lose confidence in us.
The communists quickly gained the upper hand. Our principal enemies are the fascists, they said, but these include the agents who work with them. And this included the militia that Orwell had signed up with.
Of course, in time of war, differences of political opinion can become very life and death issues.
Sam Lesser was a member of the British Communist Party who'd fought in the defence of Madrid. He met Orwell in Barcelona.
I met him very briefly and had an argument with him.
Sam Lesser had been wounded fighting with the International Brigade, crawling on his hands and knees for nearly a mile before anybody found a stretcher, and not an ambulance in sight. He believed that Orwell's militia was not pulling its weight in the fight against fascism.
I hope people can well understand my personal feeling of indignation walking around Barcelona and seeing the most up-to-date ambulances being paraded around Barcelona and kept in Barcelona. We in the International Brigade on that front were in rags, literally in rags, so that in time of war, in political differences like that, it's understandable people can turn around and say, well, what you are doing objectively plays into the hands of the fascists, and there is a very narrow step then to say, well, you in fact maybe are a fascist.
By now, the situation in Barcelona was getting more confusing and more violent. In their room at the Hotel Continental, Orwell and Eileen could hear sporadic bursts of machine gun fire. They felt safe until a bullet came through the hotel window, shattering the glass. Orwell's militia had their main office nearby, and they were preparing to defend it. Orwell was told to go up to the roof of a cinema across the street to stand guard and watch out for any attacks. He would be there for 3 sleepless days and nights. One day he had a visitor, his former colleague at the second-hand bookshop in London, John Kimchi.
He was sitting there, and when he started talking, it was like as if he was resuming the conversations we had in Hampstead. You know, it was the same tone and the same approach and the same attitude. He was making comments about the inefficiency of the militia and the inadequacy of their equipment and of the rifles and munition. And then, I think 2 days later or 3 days later, they went up the front.
Orwell went back to the trenches on May the 10th, 1937. 10 days later, in the early morning of May 20th, his luck ran out. Or maybe he was just careless.
We were standing to at dawn.
Frank Frankfurt.
We were talking, we were sitting there, and Orwell was there, and he was a very tall man, he was over 6 foot. He was leaning against the parapet, which I suppose was about 5 foot. And we were talking, he was talking to us about his experiences in Paris. And dawn came up, and his head obviously was silhouetted over the top of the parapet. And there was a shot, bang, and down went Orwell.
With blood bubbling out of his mouth. The sniper's bullet had gone straight through his throat, missing a main artery by a millimeter.
No pain, only a violent shock. It was like being at the center of an explosion.
He had a feeling of utter weakness, he said, but also a vague feeling of satisfaction.
This ought to please my wife, I thought. She always wanted me to be wounded, which would save me from being killed when the great battle came.
It was a long and bumpy ride to a field hospital. 3 weeks and several hospitals later, he was back in Barcelona. He was examined and given a medical discharge. Declared useless, he said. Now that he was free from military obligations, Orwell began walking around the streets, taking in the mood.
There was a peculiar evil feeling in the air, an atmosphere of suspicion, fear, uncertainty, and veiled hatred. Police spies everywhere.
And in this strange new Barcelona, he met a young Canadian, a journalist from Toronto, William Creme.
I was 22. I was a young socialist of a drastic sort, looking forward to the millennium that would replace the rather depressing reality of capitalism as it existed. I was quite informed about the seamy sides of communism.
And by now the communists were firmly in control of this deadly war within a war.
If you were against anything the communists did, you were made out to be an ally of Franco.
William Creme was in Barcelona writing political pamphlets which were openly critical of Stalin, and it wasn't long before he was arrested.
Just scooped up, put in freshly constructed underground cells, these newly carpentered cells in the basement, not Spanish government cells at all, GPU cells, Russian secret police. There we were for a week. There was a big hue and cry raised. When we were finally extracted from there and put in a government prison, we were saved. We were thrown out of the country. those of us who survived.
The question was, would Orwell survive? After he got his medical discharge, he went to check on Eileen in the hotel. She was in the lobby, waiting for him.
She put an arm around my neck, and with a sweet smile, for the benefit of the other people there, hissed in my ear, Get out of here at once, and hide yourself before they phone the police."
Eileen told Orwell that the police had invaded their hotel room.
Taken my diaries, my war souvenirs, and all our letters, seized every scrap of paper we possessed, except, fortunately, our passports and checkbook.
The organization that Orwell had joined was now banned, and police were hunting down anyone who was associated with it.
It was an extraordinary, insane existence. By day, we were prosperous English visitors, but by night, we were criminals.
Sleeping rough in a burned-out building or a cemetery, like his friend and comrade-in-arms, Stafford Cotman.
After the sleeping out few days, we decided that we would go to the British consul and make arrangements to leave.
The British consul got their passports in order, but the next train for France didn't leave till the following day. Eileen managed to slip out of the hotel without the police noticing, and she and Orwell and Stafford Cotman spent their last night in Spain in a room above a small restaurant near the train station, hoping that the manager wouldn't ask too many questions.
The chap was very understanding. He said, "I shan't report to you or anything like that. You needn't worry, if you're leaving in the morning, there'll be no trouble."
When morning came, Stafford Cotman, Orwell and Eileen bought first-class tickets, got on the train, and made their dash to France.
2 detectives came round, taking the names of foreigners, but when they saw us in the dining car, they seemed satisfied that we were respectable. Only 6 months ago, it was looking like a proletarian that made you respectable. Now, it was the other way around. To look bourgeois was the one salvation.
They crossed the French border without incident, and a few days later they crossed the English Channel too, and were in a train heading for London. Orwell stared out of the window, comforted by old familiar sights.
Wild flowers, deep meadows, slow-moving streams bordered by willows. It was the England I had known in my childhood.
It was, said Orwell, a country
sleeping a deep, deep sleep, from which I fear we shall never wake, till we are jerked out of it by the roar of bombs.
Orwell wrote his book about Spain quickly to capture it all while it was fresh in his mind, the social revolution in Catalonia, and how he believed that it had been crushed by communists, supported and controlled from Moscow. But Orwell's publisher, Victor Gollancz, was friends with leading British communists, and he rejected the book before even a word had been written, saying that his decision was, quote, nothing to do with party discipline, but because he believed it could harm the fight against fascism. But there was probably a bit more to it than that. Orwell said he wanted to capture the truth about what I had seen in Spain. Gollancz was now questioning Orwell's concept of truth, even his honesty as a writer.
And my father wrote a letter in 1956, headed Confidential.
This is Livia Gollancz, Victor Gollancz's daughter.
In which he says, his literary honesty was impeccable. I mean, I doubt whether he ever said anything other than he thought he meant, ever used words for mere effect, and so on and so forth. His intellectual honesty is another matter. In my opinion, he was always a trifle dishonest, too desperately anxious to be honest, to be really honest. Did he, I'm trying to say, give full play to those doubts, hesitations and searchings about the truth, which are the lot of all of us, but which so many try to stifle? I think so myself. And then there's a P.S. Incidentally, I think Orwell is enormously overrated. Well, I think my father may have been wrong about that.
The war in Spain was Orwell's defining political experience. It gave him a hopeful vision of a classless society and of socialism in action. It also left him with a nightmare image of how quickly and violently the communists could sweep their opponents out of the way. In Barcelona, Orwell had been targeted by the communists, and when he got back to England, he realized that he was still a target. The British Communist Party was trying to discredit him and undermine his reputation. One of the men he'd fought with in Spain was denounced as a fascist, and Orwell knew that he could be next, and he threatened legal action.
I don't know if it is libelous to say that I am in fascist pay, but I am taking counsel's opinion. I hate to take up this threatening attitude to members of a working-class party, but one has the right to defend oneself against malignant personal attacks.
Homage to Catalonia was Orwell's attempt to warn people against communism, especially left-wingers who still believed that the Soviet Union was a progressive force in the world. It was published in April 1938, but it made no impact on public opinion. In fact, it sold less than 1,000 copies in its first year. Orwell's voice was drowned out by the growing and sinister sound of a much bigger war, the war against Hitler. And it didn't help that when the book came out, Orwell was flat on his back in hospital. A tubercular lesion on one of his lungs had hemorrhaged. There was blood everywhere, and he'd been taken in an ambulance on a long and nerve-wracking journey across London to a sanatorium in the southeast of England. He arrived in the late afternoon when most of the patients were in the dining room having a cup of tea.
Then came this tall gentleman.
Victor Stacy was one of them.
Rather roughish looking, I thought.
Victor Stacy was puzzled to see many of Orwell's visitors showing up in big, shiny cars.
Quite important looking people. I've never discovered who these people might be.
Orwell was put in the room next to Victor Stacy, and after a while they started chatting and getting to know each other.
He never used to discuss himself. He never ever mentioned this about writing papers or books. But he always seemed to get you talking about yourself. And when he looked at you with penetrating eyes. I've never seen such eyes.
The walls of the sanatorium were thin.
And I suppose I must have been making a noise. And suddenly the door flung open and he says, "Are you all right? Are you all right?" You see, he was concerned.
Orwell made good progress at the sanatorium, but winter was approaching and his doctors advised that it would be best for him to spend it in a warm climate. Thanks to a loan from a wealthy friend, Orwell and Eileen were able to go to Morocco. They rented a villa in Marrakesh, and here Orwell began writing a novel full of dreamy, nostalgic reveries of a peaceful, stable England.
A world before aeroplanes, before Hitler.
The book was called Coming Up for Air, and as well as harking back to a disappearing past, it captures Orwell's increasingly gloomy view of the future.
I see it all,
says his main character.
The processions, the posters with enormous faces, and the crowds cheering for the leader till they deafen themselves into thinking that they really do worship him. Some days I know it's impossible. Other days I know it's inevitable.
Coming Up for Air was published in June 1939. It sold well and got good reviews. But then Orwell got some news that darkened the mood. His father was dying of cancer.
He was very, very fond of his father, and he always wanted his father to be proud of him.
This is Mabel Fiertz, who'd helped Orwell get started as a writer. Orwell told her that he'd been able to show his father the new book, and told him how well it was doing.
He was very glad about that, because he wanted his father to think well of him, because as he'd left Burmese police, his father was disappointed that he'd thrown up a career. He didn't think that he'd ever make money as a writer, which he was wrong, of course. So his father and he parted friends when his father died.
Orwell's father was spared the catastrophe that was about to engulf the world. For years, Orwell had believed that war with Hitler was inevitable. On the night of August 22nd, 1939, he dreamt that it had already started. Imagine how he must have felt the next day to wake up and find that his dream had taken a huge step towards reality. August 23rd, 1939. Hitler and Stalin signed the Nazi-Soviet Pact. Stalin agreed that the Soviet Union would remain neutral if Hitler's Germany went to war. Communism and fascism, hard left and hard right, had made common cause, and it threw socialist and communist sympathizers everywhere into turmoil. So now people like Orwell had some serious thinking to do.
If one wanted an indication of the change in Orwell, and there was a great change, I think you would mark it off almost exactly in time at the Stalin Pact with Hitler.
Julian Simmons.
All of his thoughts about fighting a revolutionary war, which he'd had prior to that, that they were all not nonsense, but they were wrong for him. He said more or less, I knew then that if there were a war, I would fight in it, that I would do everything I could to help my country, that I was a patriot, and that I would fight even to help the Chamberlain government, which was a government that he detested, and which a few months before, 3 or 4 months before, in letters he'd been calling a fascist government.
When the war came in September 1939, Orwell tried to sign up for military service, hoping to fake my way past the doctors, as he put it. But he was rejected because of his weak chest and his recent bout of tuberculosis. It was a bitter disappointment. He tried to get other war-related work, but with no success. For Orwell, the first year of the war would be a period of frustration, confusion, and despair.
On Ideas, you heard The Orwell Tapes, the second of our 3-part series on George Orwell. It's produced and presented by Steve Wadhams. Excerpts from Orwell's books, essays, and letters were read by Graham Wright. To find out about upcoming Ideas programs, you can sign up for our weekly online newsletter. Just go to our website at cbc.ca/ideas and follow the links. You can also find more background information about the series and Orwell while you're there. That's cbc.ca/ideas. In the third and final episode, we see Orwell in wartime, the patriotic revolutionary. Orwell, the reluctant propagandist, producing programs for the BBC and using what he learned there to write his 2 most famous books, Animal Farm and 1984. We also see Orwell's battle against failing health. He would die at the age of just 46, but not before a bizarre deathbed marriage in a hospital room. I'm Paul Kennedy. Welcome to Ideas and the third and final part of our series on George Orwell. Produced and presented by Steve Wadhams. Part 3. The Road to 1984.
In his apartment, the telescreen was babbling away. Winston turned a switch, and the voice sank somewhat, though the words were still distinguishable. There was no way of shutting it off completely. The telescreen received and transmitted simultaneously. You had to live in the assumption that every sound you made was overheard, and, except in darkness, every moment scrutinized. It was even conceivable that they watched everybody all the time.
Big Brother is watching you. It may sound odd, but I think I understand Winston Smith better than most. Like George Orwell, my father was a socialist, but unlike Orwell, he was also a member of Britain's Communist Party. Not for long, but long enough for it to cost him his job. It also led to a police car being parked outside our house for several months. It was 1961, and I was still a teenager. We thought it was just a speed trap, but when a major spy scandal broke, and we learned that one of the suspects lived in our village, we realized that the police weren't watching for speeding cars, they were watching us. Winston Smith was always looking over his shoulder, wondering. And for many years I wondered too. Was there a big brother somewhere keeping track of me? Did British intelligence have a file on me? Well, they certainly did on Orwell. He was under surveillance from 1929, when he was a struggling journalist writing for left-wing publications, right up until his death in 1950. One police investigator wrote that he had, quote, advanced communist views, even though Orwell was a fierce critic of communism. The release of secret files in 2005 showed that this mistake was later corrected. The files also show that while Orwell was being watched, he was not considered a security risk. In fact, when the Second World War broke out, he showed himself to be a fierce patriot.
We are in a strange period of history, in which a revolutionary has to be a patriot, and a patriot has to be a revolutionary.
Orwell wanted to join the army, but the War Office turned him down because of his poor health. In June 1940, he joined a volunteer civil defense force, the Home Guard, but he was dismayed to find that the officers were mainly ex-army.
The usual senile imbeciles, men who would probably defect to Hitler if the invasion actually happened.
But Orwell also saw an opportunity. Maybe the Home Guard could be turned into a revolutionary army, a citizens' army.
1 million men with rifles in their hands.
And I think he may have taken this image a little bit from the Spanish Civil War.
Stephen Spender.
Barcelona in 1937 did have this appearance that the people had taken over, the people had come into the sort of inheritance of their own city.
And what if it was London and not Barcelona? What did Orwell think an English revolution might look like?
I dare say the London gutters will have to run with blood. All right, let them, if it is necessary. But when the red militias are billeted in the Ritz, I shall still feel that the England I was taught to love so long ago and for such different reasons is somehow persisting.
Years later, Orwell recanted opinions like this and admitted that he'd been wrong in arguing that only a revolution could save England from Hitler.
I fell into the trap of assuming that war and the revolution are inseparable. How could I write such things?
Although Orwell couldn't find a job that would help the war effort, his wife Eileen did. She worked for the censorship department, and for the first months of the war she commuted between London and the cottage in Wallington. Friends would sometimes show up, looking for a roof over their head. Patricia Donahue, for example. She'd been bombed out of her London apartment, and so had a friend of hers. It wasn't an easy journey. The bus from London dropped them off at the nearest town, and after that it was a 4-mile walk.
And I always remember that walk because it was a bomber's moon, and you could see the shadows of the bushes were lying across that road in the moonlight, with these German bombers sort of burning away up top. Anyhow, we eventually arrived at the cottage. We went in, and they were in the middle of their supper. They were very welcoming. We shared their supper then, and had some of Eileen's very nice apple meringue pie.
Orwell may have been turned down for military service, but at the cottage he was ready for action.
George had a distinct military side to him, and he was interested in weapons, really. I mean, there are a lot of weapons there. Daggers, mostly, hanging up on the walls, quite a number of them.
It wasn't as crazy as it sounds. Orwell had good reason to be prepared.
There was a great deal of alarm and consternation about parachute troops, the Germans dropping parachute troops, you see, in country places, and just then knocking at people's doors. And one fine night, late in the evening, knock came at the door. George immediately seized his gun, stood behind the door at the ready, tense, while Eileen opened the door.
Perhaps Orwell was disappointed that it was just a neighbour from the village. Eventually, he and Eileen decided to close up the cottage and move to London full-time.
He surprised me very much on one occasion.
Julian Simmons.
By saying, I hate London. I really would like to get out of it. But of course you can't leave while people are being bombed to bits all around you. Well, I would have been very happy to get out of London if I could.
Finally, Orwell found a meaningful outlet for his patriotic energy. He was asked to write a pamphlet analysing the war from a left-wing perspective and to come up with a prescription for change, a picture of what a socialist post-war Britain would look like. The booklet had a suitably patriotic-sounding title,
It was called The Lion and the Unicorn.
2 images in Britain's royal coat of arms.
And in it Orwell wrote, as it were, as a patriotic socialist.
This is Tosco Fievel.
He hoped for a British revolution, but it had to be a patriotic revolution.
In The Lion and the Unicorn, Orwell laid out what he hated about England, but also what he loved.
Solid breakfasts, gloomy Sundays, smoky towns, winding roads, green fields and red pillar boxes, good-tempered bus conductors, policemen without revolvers, and old maids biking to Holy Communion through the mists of an autumn morning.
As the war dragged on and German submarines began to sink more and more supply ships, Britain's lifelines were getting dangerously thin. There were serious shortages of oil and raw materials for industry. Food was getting scarce. Restaurants struggled to keep going.
On the menu, there would always be one, as you might say, fairly decent thing, one real thing, like liver and bacon, perhaps. George would never order that.
Julian Simmons often went to lunch with Orwell and marvelled at his cheerful, almost masochistic attitude.
He would always order the very worst thing, the thing that one would normally avoid, as you might say, the victory pie. And he would eat this revolting stuff when it came to him, eat it with the greatest relish, and then say, again with some relish, "You won't get anything better than this nowadays anywhere."
Orwell's patriotic pamphlet, The Lion and the Unicorn, was published in February 1941. 6 months later, he finally found war-related work that paid a decent wage. He got a job at the BBC.
Well, he was awfully nice, George Orwell. He was so friendly, you know. He wasn't one of those people who are too important, as it were, to know you.
This is Henry Swansea. He'd also just joined the BBC, and he met Orwell on a training course.
We were all supposed to go out in the London streets and come back and do an eyewitness report. He and I went on the top of a bus down Park Lane, towards Hyde Park Corner, really. But I'm not absolutely certain whether he even produced a script, because he didn't sort of take a very close interest in a lot of the activities, really.
The BBC knew that Orwell was an outspoken critic of empire, but nevertheless they hired him as a producer in the Empire department to help them find a way to counter German radio broadcasts to India. It was a tricky assignment.
Most of our broadcasters are Indian left-wing intellectuals, some of them bitterly anti-British.
Orwell had to convince them that by broadcasting for Britain, they would be helping the cause of freedom for India.
They do it because they know what a fascist victory would mean to the chances of Indian independence.
Orwell's programs to India were mainly talks and discussions. They were meant to sound open and spontaneous, but in fact everything was scripted, written and rewritten to satisfy government censors. Orwell did the editing, and often he found himself putting words into other people's mouths.
One develops a cunning one did not previously have.
At first he accepted his role as a propagandist, even to relish it.
I am alleging in all my newsletters that the Japanese are plotting to attack Russia, but I don't believe this to be so.
I used to meet him quite frequently in the canteen, rather sort of forbidding in his approach to people.
This is Sunday Wilshin. She would take over Orwell's job after he left the BBC.
But at the same time, you could feel this inner warmth in him.
Orwell was a professional writer, but in the craft of radio, he was an amateur.
On one occasion, somebody said to him, "You never use any effects in your programs, George." And he said, "What are effects?" And they answered, "Well, you know, there's an effects department. You can get, of course, music, we know about that, but any other sounds, noises, background, things of that kind." He said, "Oh, yes, that's very interesting," and was heard by his secretary to ring up the effects department and say, "I believe you have effects." And they said, "Yes, that's right, sir." And he said, "Oh, well, send me a nice mixed lot of effects, will you?" He had no idea what it meant.
Internal management memos reveal a debate about what name Orwell should use at the BBC. Would the broadcasts have more impact, perhaps, if he used the name on the cover of his books? Or should he use his real name, Eric Blair, which almost nobody in India would recognize? Desmond Hawkins, another BBC colleague, believes that the tension over the name went much deeper than that. He has a letter that Orwell wrote during his time at the BBC.
And it has a reference up in the corner, E.B. The letter was signed George Orwell. I think he typed it, and E.B. undoubtedly was Eric Blair. This was a complex man because you felt that he had these two identities in him all the time, and he was constantly adjusting them, tuning them, and in a small way, that illustrated it to me.
In 1943, after 2 years of being buffeted and boxed in by the censors at the Ministry of Information, trying to keep the propaganda, as he put it,
slightly less disgusting than it might otherwise have been,
Orwell had exhausted his patriotic wish to serve the war effort, and he resigned.
I feel like an orange that has been trodden on by a very dirty boot.
Desmond Hawkins understands why Orwell would say that his time at the BBC was 2 wasted years, but as an immersion in modern forms of propaganda, he thinks it was time well spent.
We were listening to the full blast of the greatest revolution in propagandist broadcasting, of course, that Western Europe had seen, which was the German propaganda machine. And part of Orwell's job, after all, was to unravel it and counter it. This was very much a new use of the media.
Powerful, mind-bending techniques that would find a home in Orwell's nightmare world of 1984.
And I think what Orwell seized on in 1984 was to push to extremes what he had observed, that if you once start playing with truth, if you once start conditioning people, if you once start using the loudspeaker in the canteen, the tannoy system or whatever, to keep putting over the slightly bent message all the time and the slightly twisted language all the time, that this is the new potent force. And yes, bless him, I mean, he spotted that a generation ahead of many.
The BBC gave Orwell more than a crash course in the malignant manipulation of language. What else did he get that might have found its way into the world of 1984? Well, the Ministry of Truth, where Winston Smith spent his days changing facts and rewriting history at the whim of the party, looks a lot like Britain's Ministry of Information, controlling and censoring broadcasts, changing scripts, not to suit the facts, but to suit the politics of the moment. The powerful boss at the Ministry of Information was a man called Brendan Bracken, known to all apparently by his initials, BB. Does BB sound like Big Brother? And does Orwell's Newspeak have its origins in something called Basic English, which was a new artificial language fashionable at the time? The idea was to turn complex thoughts into simple, even simplistic ones, and Orwell was one of 3 BBC staffers commissioned to test out Basic English on actual news broadcasts. Once he was out of the BBC, Orwell quickly regained his creative freedom. In November 1943, he was offered a job as literary editor of a left-wing magazine. It was called Tribune.
Most agreeable person to get on with, very pleasant.
George Strauss was one of the directors.
But you knew that behind this rather easy person there was an iron will. He was obviously strong, but would never try to impose his strength on you or people he was talking to. He'd discuss, he'd never force a point.
Orwell knew that he was too soft-hearted to be a good editor.
I have a fatal tendency to accept manuscripts which I know are too bad to be printed.
What he really enjoyed was writing his weekly column. The title, As I Please, said it all. And what pleased Orwell was to range freely over a wide range of topics, from totalitarianism.
It's a mistake to imagine you can have any secret freedom. Your thoughts are never entirely your own.
To the joys of a nice cup of tea
I maintain that 1 cup of strong tea is better than 20 weak ones.
The As I Please columns that he wrote in Tribune look much better now than they did when they were written.
Julian Simmons.
This is the most impressive tribute one could pay to them as works of journalism. They are one of the forms in which his talent was able to express itself most easily and clearly.
But Orwell found the perfect expression of his ideas in a little book he called a fable, or a fairy story.
George was terrible at describing the plots of his books.
This is Orwell's friend, Michael Mayer.
And I said, "Oh, what are you writing now, George?" And he said, "I'm writing a kind of parable. You see, there's this farm, and the animals are dreadfully tyrannized over by the human beings, so they decide they'll throw the humans out. So they throw the humans out, and they run the farm themselves, and they run it just as badly as the human beings, and then they get the human beings back to come and help them run the farm." And I said, "Yes, yes." And he said, "Yes, well, I think that's quite a good plot for a book, don't you?" And I thought, dear me. And then when the book came out, one sat there staggered, because anything less like that awful summary he'd given to me, one couldn't imagine.
Animal Farm would do brilliantly what Orwell's earlier book, Homage to Catalonia, had totally failed to do.
To see the Soviet Union for what it really is.
Malcolm Muggeridge.
I mean, I think he was pointing the finger at the USSR, obviously, especially in its manifestations in Spain. But at the same time, I think that George was really making a case against every form of authoritarian government. But he was also saying that this is the way things are going. This sense that human beings the Western people were going to lose their taste for freedom. This is what he dreaded.
A heavy subject, but Orwell's little fairy story gave it a very light touch. And Lettice Cooper believed that Orwell's wife, Eileen, had a lot to do with that.
He read it aloud to her every night when he'd written it, the piece he'd done that day. And she thought once that this was a winner, that it was the most attractive thing he'd done yet. And she used to tell us about it every morning when we were having coffee. This was very exciting.
The leaders of the revolution at the farm were 2 pigs. One was called Napoleon, and the other was called Snowball. In Soviet terms, Stalin and Trotsky. Julian Simmons.
He pointed out that Trotsky, who was Snowball, was potentially just as big a villain as Stalin, who was Napoleon, although he was the victim of Napoleon, because the first note of corruption was struck when the pigs secretly had the cow's milk added to their own mash, and Snowball consented to that first act of inequality.
Orwell finished the manuscript in 1944, but could he find a publisher? The problem was that the Soviet Union was now Britain's ally in the war against Hitler.
It wasn't a good time to write such a book which could be construed as an attack upon our ally, the Soviet Union. But of course, Orwell said, of course, the time when the Soviet Union was popular in Britain was absolutely just the time at which the whole corrupt nature of the Russian state ought to be exposed.
One after another, publishers returned the manuscript of Animal Farm. Orwell, perhaps a little paranoid after his experience at the BBC, suspected a hidden hand, the censors at Britain's Ministry of Information.
There's no clear statement that this or that must not be printed, but circus dogs jump when the trainer cracks his whip.
Finally, Orwell did find a dog that refused to jump. But when his explosive little fairy story was published in August 1945, the fighting had ended and the Cold War was beginning. And perhaps because now the Soviet Union was enemy number 1, Animal Farm was an instant hit.
And I did then say to him, "Well, George, it's wonderful, isn't it? No more money worries."
This is Mary Fievel.
And he answered me, "Oh, Mary, but it's fairy gold, fairy gold." That I remember distinctly. He was so naive and money matters, so unused to having any money, that he had, in that first year when Animal Farm sold well, made £10,000, of which £6,000 was taken by the income tax.
During the 18-month struggle to get Animal Farm published, Orwell and Eileen had started a family. Orwell longed to have a child, but he believed himself for some reason to be sterile. He talked to Eileen about adopting a baby boy, but Eileen wasn't sure it was a good idea.
She was very nervous about it.
This is Lettice Cooper.
She was afraid that as he was not her own, she might not love him enough. But she didn't want to deprive George. George wanted him passionately.
And so, in the first week of June 1944, Orwell and Eileen brought home a baby boy. They named him Richard, after Orwell's father.
And the two things he wanted for the adopted baby were to have a cream perambulator with a gold line round it and have it put down for Eton.
Orwell launched into fatherhood. He was, friends said, the happiest they'd ever seen him. But the happiness would be short-lived. In March 1945, Orwell went to France and Germany to write articles for David Astor at the Observer newspaper.
He wanted to go and see in what condition Germany was at the end of the war.
And while he was abroad, Orwell got a telegram with shocking news. Eileen was dead. She'd gone into hospital to have a fairly routine procedure, a hysterectomy, but she died on the operating table. It seems the medical team didn't realize that she might not be strong enough to survive the anesthetic.
Apparently there was something wrong with her heart, because when they did this operation, they ought to have found out beforehand something about the walls of her heart. And they didn't. And that was why she died under the anesthetic.
How did Orwell take the sudden death of his wife? Some friends remember a man openly grieving, whose tears could not be checked.
I heard him call another woman by Eileen's name several times after she died.
Poet Paul Potts.
It was more embarrassing than ever because they just adopted Richard. And he told me the last time he saw her, he wanted to tell her that he loved her much more now since they'd had Richard. And he didn't tell her that, and he regretted it immensely.
David Astor asked Orwell if, without Eileen, he would give up Richard. But Orwell would hear nothing of it.
It was the only time it seemed to me he almost became angry that I questioned that he might do anything else, and he was quite determined to stick to this child, and did.
Eventually, Orwell hired a full-time housekeeper, Susan Watson.
I liked him immediately, and he looked so lonely. And he said, "Can you cook?" So I said, "Not very much." And he said, "Never mind, we can live on fish and chips." And then he laughed, and when he laughed, he really laughed. It was like the sun coming out.
One night, Susan heard a noise in the hallway. Orwell was having a hemorrhage. Susan asked if she could help.
And he said, "Oh, you can get a jug of iced water and a block of ice, a square of ice, and wrap it up, put it on my head." And you see, the strange thing about this was that he never told me that he was tubercular.
You're listening to The Orwell Tapes on Ideas, the third and final episode in our series on George Orwell. The series is based on a unique archive of interviews with people who knew Orwell, and it's produced and presented by Steve Wadhams.
In 1945, with the war over, Orwell was 42 years old, a widower, a successful writer with serious health problems, and a father with a little boy to bring up. Could he find another wife for company and to help him look after Richard? His great friend, Arthur Koestler, had a young and attractive sister-in-law who'd recently separated from her husband. Maybe she would be a good prospect.
Arthur practically went on his knees and implored me to marry George, and he would have loved to have George as a brother-in-law. He thought it was a wonderful idea.
This is Celia Goodman. In early 1946, Orwell proposed to her and went on to say that if she didn't want to marry him, maybe she would agree to have an affair with him.
I didn't want to marry George because I didn't quite think that it would be the right thing for me. And I didn't want to have an affair with him either, not because I didn't think George was attractive, but because he was such a serious person that you couldn't have an affair with him without being involved with him. And if you were going to get involved with him, you might as well marry him, and I didn't want to marry him.
A few months later, Orwell made a similar proposal to another young woman, Anne Popham. She had an apartment in the same building as Orwell, and one day he bumped into her on the stairs, and they got talking.
And a little while later there was a plop through the door, and I found a note.
It was an invitation to come to Orwell's apartment for afternoon tea.
We sat with Susan Watson and the little boy, Richard, at a sort of tea table and had nice brown bread and honey and things like that. And the tea was over, and he said, dismissed Susan and Richard, said, go along now, and then said to me, come and sit here, it'll be more comfortable, on the bed in the corner. And I think he embraced me and sort of said, you're very attractive, and do you think you could care for me, and things like that. And I find it all very embarrassing, because it was so precipitate in a way, so calculated and precipitate. And so I said, I'm sorry, I'm going. And he said, can I write to you?
Anne was heading off to Germany the next day. She was working for the temporary government that Britain had set up there after the war. A couple of weeks later, she got this letter from Orwell.
In a way, it's scandalous that a person like me should make advances to a person like you. And yet I thought from your appearance you were not only lonely and unhappy, but also a person who lived chiefly through the intellect and might become interested in a man who was much older and not much good physically. You asked me what attracted me to you in the first place. You're very beautiful, as no doubt you well know, but that wasn't quite all. I do so want someone who will share what is left of my life and my work. It isn't so much a question of someone to sleep with, though of course I want that too, sometimes. What I'm really asking you is whether you would like to be the widow of a literary man. If I can live another 10 years, I think I have another 3 worthwhile books in me. But I want peace and quiet and someone to be fond of me.
Orwell wanted 10 more years and 3 books. In fact, he would get 5 years and 1 book, 1984. But he did get the peace and quiet that he longed for. He would write 1984 in an old farmhouse at the northern tip of the island of Jura, off the west coast of Scotland. No phone, no electricity, and no doctor anywhere near.
He arrived looking very gaunt and thin and worn, a very sick-looking man.
Orwell rented the house from Margaret Nelson and her husband.
Very haggard-looking, as if he'd been through a great deal, which indeed he had.
They put Orwell up for the night, and the next morning they piled into the Land Rover and drove up 7 miles of rough, bumpy track to a large and gloomy-looking stone house. It hadn't been lived in for years.
We opened this door and came into this sort of scullery place, into the kitchen, where there was an old-fashioned kitchen range with an open fire and a oven at the side, as all the houses used to have in those days. There was a table and a chair which we'd brought up, and I think we had bought a bed and some old mats for the floor.
Orwell would write most of 1984 in a bedroom above the kitchen, looking out on open moorland and the sea.
And this is the desk which he wrote in. This was his sort of filing cabinet. Nobody really came up here, because he would have been shutting himself away to write.
It was true isolation, at the northern tip of a remote island with the nearest people 1.5 miles away. Local farmers Donald and Katie Darragh.
Well, he was a very good neighbour. We came up for milk at first, made himself at home, drawing his chair. I can't resist your scones, Katie.
After a week on his own, Orwell was joined by his sister Avril and her boyfriend Bill Dunn.
I would hear him typing, but never knew anything about what he was doing.
But Bill Dunn did know one thing. Orwell was a heavy smoker.
And the window was tight shut and the door was tight shut, which was really must have been terribly bad for him.
But that was typical of George. He drove himself very hard, and any kind of self-pampering he regarded as kind of immoral, you know.
This is Michael Mayer. One day he got a letter inviting him to come and visit Orwell in his Scottish hideaway.
He says, "We're chronically short of bread and flour, frequently not too well off for cooking fats and sugar. It's lovely here when the weather is at all bearable. For the last few weeks it was foul. I didn't think that was the place for me to go, and I never went."
In July 1946, Orwell made a quick trip to London to fetch Susan Watson and young Richard. Immediately there was friction. Orwell's sister, Avril, made it plain that Susan wasn't welcome.
She looked at me with extreme disapproval, and she said, "And you're not to call George George." And I said, well, he asked me to do it, you see. And he said, his proper name is Eric, you see.
Susan Watson invited a friend to come for a visit. David Holbrook was a young writer, and he was looking forward to meeting Orwell. But Orwell gave him a very frosty reception. At the time, David Holbrook was a member of the British Communist Party, and he thinks that Orwell suspected that he'd been sent to spy on him.
He was probably in the mood of 1984, you can imagine. He was deeply disturbed by the thought that the party might be watching him. It just seemed depressingly lacking in hope, as he was. That was what was so strange, to go into this remoteness and find this man really expressing a loss of hope for the future of the world. It was certainly not a jolly occasion at all.
When David Holbrook left, Susan Watson went with him. They packed their bags and they walked off down the rough track to start the long journey back to London. And Orwell went back to his upstairs room, to his typewriter, and the grim world of 1984.
He was writing about dictatorship in an age of real dictatorship.
This is Tosco Fievel.
When Hitler and all his horrors were only destroyed two years or so previously, and Stalin was still in full control. And that was what he was writing about.
There is another view. Some people believe that the world of 1984 is really the world of Orwell's childhood, writ large, a sadomasochistic fantasy rooted in mental wounds and memories of petty tyrannies suffered as a small boy at school.
Room 101, where the worst thing in the world happens, is rather the headmaster's study to which you were called when you had sinned and transgressed, and the rules of the party which had to be obeyed were like the rules of the prep school. Well, one could go on like that. I mean, the point is, of course, that Orwell drew on his own psychological traumas in writing about 1984. But the world of 1984 was a world which was very much meant to reflect the outside world, not his inner traumas.
The title was not meant to convey what life was going to be like in 1984.
This is Julian Simmons.
The book was written or completed in 1948. The two last figures were just inverted. It is a book which is largely, in fact, about the problems of Britain in 1948.
A country struggling to recover after a long war, with bombed-out buildings, food shortages, and power cuts.
Winston Smith slipped through the glass doors of Victory Mansions, though not quickly enough to prevent a swirl of gritty dust from entering along with him. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and old rag mats. Winston made for the stairs. It was no use trying the lift. Even at the best of times, it was seldom working.
After the war, Britain put its future in the hands of a socialist government, but it wasn't a government that pleased Orwell. He wanted the future to belong to what he called libertarian socialism, not the kind of socialism that he was seeing. Slide rule socialism, he called it.
The socialism that tried to measure everything out, and that in measuring things out and endeavouring to do it fairly, also involved certain erosions of freedom, of individual freedom, too much erosion of freedom.
Many people living behind what was now being called the Iron Curtain had already lost their freedom, thrust back into servitude, as Orwell put it, living under the thumb of a new ruling class, controlled by a mixture of force and fraud, living secret lives in fear of the secret police. Could it happen in Britain?
I don't believe that the kind of society I describe will happen, but I believe something resembling it could arrive. Totalitarian ideas have taken root in the minds of intellectuals everywhere, and I have tried to draw these ideas out to their logical consequences.
Big Brother is watching you, said Orwell. Winston Smith had nowhere to hide.
What he felt, really, was that we were facing a great social change, and a new mass society was taking over. And he felt that a society like that could very easily be abused. Although 1984 was directly an attack on Stalin's communism, but also, you see, in a faint way, it was an attack, say, on American big business, mass entertainment, the society where elections are decided by political slogans and everything becomes show business. What he felt was the end of the old bourgeois culture in which he had grown up, and which he no longer himself supported, but he was sad at its passing, and he felt that the new collective society which was coming about held grave dangers.
Just before Christmas 1947, Orwell's health broke down. He was taken to a hospital near Glasgow, and he was diagnosed with tuberculosis of the left lung. At that time, British doctors had no drugs to combat tuberculosis, but in the United States there was a new experimental drug being tested. It was called streptomycin. Orwell's friend, David Astor, used his influence to get a small amount of this drug sent to the hospital.
I think it was 100 grams we got.
This is Dr. James Williamson.
And he seemed to be perking up, but within a short space of time he developed this fearful allergic reaction.
My hair began to come out. My face became noticeably redder. The skin had a tendency to flake off, and a rash appeared all over my body. There was ulceration with blisters in my throat and little blisters on my lips. At night these blisters burst, so that in the morning my lips were stuck together.
After 50 days, the treatment was discontinued. Orwell spent 7 months in the hospital, and then, as soon as he was allowed to leave, to the horror of his friends, he went straight back to the damp and chilly farmhouse on Jura, determined to finish his book.
He had a manuscript, crisscrossed, much corrected.
Page after page of Orwell's handwriting, scribbled in blue ink over and around the black typescript. A mess of blue over black.
He asked his agent to try to send him a secretary to type the clean draft.
But his agent couldn't find anyone who was willing to go, so Orwell did it himself.
George sat down in his bedroom and clean-typed the manuscript himself, doing it in little over a month at a rate of 5,000 words a day, which for a fit man would have been quite an achievement. In his state, it was just too much, and at the end of it, he did manage to send the book away in December, but he had his terminal collapse from which he never recovered. So in a sense, he sacrificed himself for the message of 1984.
His dream of living on a remote Scottish island was over. If he wanted to live, he had to leave. So on a cold day in January 1949, he began the long journey south, knowing that even the first few miles over that bumpy track might prove fatal if his lung hemorrhaged.
And we set off in the car, deep potholes, ditches on both sides, and we got so far and the car stuck, and it wouldn't go forwards or backwards.
This is Orwell's adopted son, Richard.
And my father and I sat in the car.
He was only 5 at the time, but he remembers it well.
It was raining, it was cold, and it was getting dark. They were stuck out in the middle of nowhere, but yet he was quite cheerful. I mean, cheerful with me. He tried to pretend that nothing was wrong.
What does it feel like to be the son of George Orwell, but only to have known him for the first few years of your life?
It's a strange feeling. I can be on the outside looking in, and George Orwell is a well-known figure, and I have also the same feeling of, the alternative feeling really, is that I was his son, and that I was part of him, and he to me. So it's a very difficult situation to analyse. But he was my father, there's no question about it. Although I'd been adopted by him, he was my father.
Orwell finally made it off the remote Scottish island of Jura and found a bed in a sanatorium in the south of England. A few weeks later, he was amazed and delighted to get a letter from his childhood sweetheart, Jacintha Buddicombe. She'd just discovered that Eric Blair, Eric the famous writer of her childhood, was now a famous writer called George Orwell.
I hadn't read all his other books, but I had read Animal Farm, and I was tremendously impressed by Animal Farm. I thought it was a miraculous book, one of the best books I'd ever read.
Jacintha wrote to Orwell to congratulate him, and he wrote back.
Ever since I got your letter, I've been remembering. I can't stop thinking about the young days and things put out of mind for 20 or 30 years.
It was all fine until the last paragraph.
I am so wanting to see you. Are you fond of children? I think you must be. I do so want us to meet again. He certainly sounded fairly enthusiastic about me in that letter, didn't he?
Too enthusiastic for Jacintha, and it unnerved her.
I didn't want to put ideas into his head, because if he'd got a motherless child that he wanted to find a new mother for, well, I didn't feel that it was up to me, and so I didn't want to encourage him in any ideas of that sort.
Meanwhile, in the peace and quiet of the sanatorium, Orwell used what energy he had to tidy up the final draft of what would be his final book, 1984, and it was published on June 6, 1949. Jacintha read it, and it froze the warmth of their renewed relationship.
I thought 1984 was such a frightful book that I really shouldn't want to see him. I didn't know what to say, because all I could have said about 1984 was that I thought it was unspeakable, the most miserable, defeatist book, and I couldn't think why he'd written it, and it didn't seem at all the thing to write and to say that to him, so I didn't write to him at all.
She didn't write, and she didn't go to visit him on his sickbed in the sanatorium.
Well, I don't know. I never did seem to treat Eric perhaps as I might have.
As one woman left, another took centre stage. Her name was Sonia Brownell.
Sonia, who was in her 20s, was a beauty, an acknowledged beauty.
This is Tosco Fievel.
One can see why George fell in love with her. She was witty and incisive, the queen almost of an intellectual circle in London.
She regarded herself as the kind of person who was on the side of genius. She had a romantic conception of genius.
Stephen Spender.
Orwell fitted her idea of the sort of solitary genius who needed backing.
He felt that she was like a sort of dream person.
Malcolm Muggeridge.
This marvellous, beautiful woman who would cherish and save the life of this genius.
Sonia may have represented the dream of hope and life, but in reality, Orwell was losing his battle with tuberculosis. In September 1949, the doctors moved him from the quiet sanatorium in the countryside to a private room in a large London hospital. His hospital notebook contains this poignant paragraph.
If I look back and count up the actual amount that I have written, I see that my output has been respectable. But this does not reassure me, because it simply gives me the feeling that I once had an industriousness and a fertility which I have now lost.
But not all was lost. Orwell announced that he was planning to marry again.
I suppose everyone will be horrified, but I think I should stay alive longer if I were married.
Orwell proposed to his dream person, Sonia Brownell, and she accepted.
She, I think, didn't contract marital relations with people very easily. I think she was rather shy of all that.
David Astor.
And I think that when this man, who was obviously very feeble, asked her to marry, it may have sort of suited her to marry somebody who was rather non-operational, so to speak. So I think both of them were acting in a sort of slight fantasy way.
The marriage took place on October the 13th, 1949, in Orwell's hospital room.
I can't help saying it was an embarrassing occasion because we were sort of dressed more or less in our best clothes for a wedding, but standing in a very tiny little cubicle with a very sick man. And all looked like Gandhi. I mean, he just looked like skin and bones.
Orwell's friends were surprised to see a fishing rod at the end of his bed.
Sonia had arranged that George should fly with her to Switzerland, where he was going to go to a sanatorium.
Tosco Fievel.
But I never believed that in his state of health, where there was hardly room on his lean thighs for any more injections, that he was capable of such a journey.
And he wasn't. There would be no Swiss Alps, no clean, fresh mountain air. Orwell would breathe his last in that hospital room in London. Paul Potts was perhaps the last of his friends to see him alive.
He loved tea, and I had some tea. In those days, teas were rationed, you see, in the war. So I brought some tea. And the door had a sort of window in the door, so you could look in and see him, really. And I saw that he was asleep, and I knew he had a great deal of difficulty in getting to sleep. So I didn't wake him up. And I left the tea at the door. And I often wonder who got it.
On the night of January 21st, 1950, Orwell had a massive and fatal hemorrhage. He died quickly, and he died alone. Sonia was distraught, but some looked at her with suspicion. 3 days before Orwell died, he'd made a will. He'd provided for young Richard's education, but Sonia was the main beneficiary. Was the dream wife, the saviour of lonely genius, really just an opportunist? Had Sonia married Orwell for his money? Not possible, says her friend Diana Witherby.
She had no idea that this business of these books were all going to be selling and he was going to be so famous. I mean, he was quite famous as a writer, but nobody had any idea that it was all going to become as it is today.
Animal Farm has never been out of print. 1984 has sold millions of copies. Orwell's name is almost certain to be invoked in any discussion of propaganda, misinformation, or computer-based surveillance, the new Big Brother which can track our every move. But it's not just for his dark warnings that Orwell has lodged himself into our collective imagination. For me, at least, his legacy is much more than that. He reminds us that there is a connection between clarity of language and truth. He implores us to be vigilant, on guard for freedom, and to keep the faith, the triple faiths of decency, tolerance, and humanity. In death, Orwell gave his friends a problem to solve. He asked to be buried according to the rites of the Church of England, in a graveyard nearest to where he happened to die. But the London graveyards were full. His friend, David Astor, had an idea. Astor lived in a village called Sutton Courtenay, and he wondered if the minister of the local church would be able to help.
And he asked if I could help him to bury a friend who had died in his London hospital.
In 1950, Gordon Dunstan was the minister of that little village church.
I went to see Mr. Fred Toll, who was a retired company director living in the village, and Mr. Cecil Allen, a farmer. He has been farming here for generations. And I told them, I said, you don't know this man, but one day he'll be famous, and people will come here to see his tomb. And I gave Farmer Allen a copy of Animal Farm, and I said, I want to bury the author of this book. And they both said, go ahead, Vicar, certainly. And his grave here has just an old English rose on it, which he asked for. He asked, in fact, that it might be left untrimmed, untended, but you know how roses grow and they become straggly and a nuisance. But this is his grave. And it says quite simply, again, I believe at his own request, here lies Eric Arthur Blair, which was, of course, his proper name, born June the 25th, 1903, died January the 21st, 1950.
In an essay on Charles Dickens, Orwell painted a picture that many people feel is really a self-portrait, a perfect picture of Orwell himself.
It is the face of a man who is laughing, but with a touch of anger in his laughter. It is the face of a man who is always fighting against something, but who fights in the open and is not frightened. The face of a man who is generously angry, a type hated with equal hatred by all the smelly little orthodoxies which are now contending for our souls.
On Ideas, you heard The Orwell Tapes, the third and final episode in our series on George Orwell. It was produced and presented by Steve Wadhams. We're both honored and saddened to let you know that this is the final piece that Steve is presenting for CBC Radio. In his 4+ decades at the CBC, Steve has influenced, touched, and mentored countless of our colleagues. Steve, you're already missed. To find out about upcoming Ideas programs, sign up for our weekly online newsletter. Just go to our website at cbc.ca/ideas and follow the links. While there, you can also find some special feature material we have on the series and Orwell. Of course, you can also find us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. Excerpts from Orwell's books, essays, and letters were read by Graham Wright. Technical production, Dave Field. Associate producer, Liz Naj. The executive producer of Ideas is Greg Kelly. I'm Paul Kennedy.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.